I open by reading a hilarious comment from the audience. Manan Goenka, a longtime viewer and commenter, says, quote, he's really excited for this topic. His stance used to be until he realized that what he truly wants is for him to be able to have guns and for everyone else not to be able to have it. Be sensitive to those rights that you would preach only as a private privilege for a few and not for the many. If you don't think a right would be used well and appropriately by your worst enemies, then perhaps it should not be a right at all. And this comes up a great deal, obviously, in talking about freedom of speech. If you don't really believe freedom of speech can and should be had in practice by your worst enemies. So, guys, we are living through a period of time when the history of the Constitution of the United States of America is being rewritten. It's being understood in a completely different way. Some of these books I recommend more than others. Some of them are better written than others. If you just click on the description of this video, many of my viewers never do, you will find links to two books that we're here going to discuss at some length. I'm going to make reference to Woody Holton again, just a book I frequently advertise and mention in terms of what the new school of thought is and looking back and reinterpreting the United States of America. And this guy, Robert Parkinson, let's make sure I'm getting his name right, who has written 13 Clocks. So that is one book I cannot hold up for you on camera because I've been reading it as a Kindle ebook on my cell phone. But it's the cover of that book appears in the thumbnail of this video for a reason, and those are the two books mentioned in the description for a reason. So partly this is going to be a discussion about new perspectives on, new understandings of the history of the American Constitution. It is partly going to be a critique of those two authors, of Parkinson and Woody Holton, because I have a different perspective, different emphasis, different direction to take in this video. And partly, as you have all guessed, again, there's a lot of information just in the title and thumbnail for this video. This is partly going to be a response to the renewed debate about the right to bear arms, about legislation to regulate or delimit Americans' right to own and use guns, which is a great illustration of the more profound and fundamental questions I want to raise here about law itself, about democracy itself, and indeed about the concept of progress. Now, I open this video with some hesitation by talking about the most impalpable and abstract aspect of the debate, which is the idea of progress. Our whole concept of what a revolution is, our concept of what a constitution is at this moment is poisoned by our presuppositions about progress. We are trained from an early age to think about political progress as if it were in some sense equivalent to scientific progress. So let's just reflect on this for a moment. In the progress of science, we are told there are things that in the past were unknown, then they become known, and everything in our society changes to reflect what's now established as known, which has real, demonstrable, palpable consequences. So there was a time when nobody understood the nature of tooth decay, and going to the dentist was unbelievably painful and terrifying and expensive, right? And our whole society for untold centuries lived in fear of tooth decay. It's not too much to say that. They lived in fear of the dentist. Again, whether that was in terms of what it would cost you or just the physical pain you would go through when having teeth pulled out of your head. Then there were these scientific discoveries, including the understanding of fluoride and its efficacy in preventing tooth decay. And then we started to have ever more coercive laws and educational policies of teaching every child that they should use fluoride, of adding fluoride to the drinking water, all these other things that remain controversial. It is. Every time I go to buy toothpaste, I'm amazed at how many brands still to this day advertise that they're fluoride free for that, hippie market, for the people who don't believe in fluoride, people who believe hysterical conspiracy theories about fluoride, right? So this is an idea of irreversible, universal, objectively real progress. Now, I'm already hinting at the extent to which it is not so universal as we might like to believe, because when I go to buy toothpaste, whether or not one should buy toothpaste that has fluoride in it remains controversial. Believe it or not, whether or not there should be fluoride in the drinking water remains controversial too. And I've heard both sides of that argument, by the way. to what extent that's science and to what extent that's pseudoscience remains controversial. But for the purpose of this video, just pointing out, we, all of us, anyone who speaks any modern language, not just modern Western language, if you grew up speaking Chinese, if you grew up speaking Japanese to an astonishing extent throughout the whole world, globally, you are raised with a notion of unidirectional progress that moves in one direction. As science goes from unknown to known, as things go from suspicions and apprehensions and superstitions, they're dragged into the realm of facts. Then we adapt, our culture changes, our laws change, our policies change in response to that progress. And something subtle but important here. In this model, government is not creating progress. Government is not creating change. Government is lagging behind scientific change, right? Some scientist somewhere, perhaps in a university, right, discovers something, and then government and democracy follows along afterward in imperfectly legislating behind it. That's also a very important and, in my opinion, false assumption, as opposed to looking at progress as something that is innovated nowhere other than in the halls of power in government, and really taking seriously the role of government as innovator, not as responding to and lagging behind innovation. Okay. The history of prostitution in France. At any given moment in that story, it was very easy to speak of progress. It was very easy to pretend this was the superstitious notion in the Dark Ages. These were the superstitious, unscientific attitudes of the medieval world. And then something became known that formerly was unknown and resulted in new laws, a new constitution, if you like, changes. When I say constitution, I don't just mean a written constitution, but this slightly more nebulous sense of how our society operates at all time on the basis of things written and unwritten, things known and unknown. That France made a transition from prostitution being illegal to prostitution being legal. If you don't know this, spend some time with the Wikipedia article. Guess what? France made the transition back again. Okay? They tried having a society with legal prostitution. They didn't like the consequences. And then they tried something else. And I'm slightly simplifying the history. If you go through it decade by decade and century by century, you'll see at different times it shifted back and forth. But to simplify, you can indeed say of France that the pendulum swung out in one direction and then it swung back again. Right next door, Germany has a totally different history with prostitution. On the other side of the world, the history of prostitution in Japan, the history of prostitution in Taiwan, the history of prostitution in South Korea. Okay? There is no progress. There are only revisions. There are only constitutional amendments, if you like. The reason why I prefer the term revision to amendment is that built into the concept of amendment is that you are mending something. There is a rip in the fabric, or there's an imperfection in the Constitution that you mend, right? I'm just talking about revisions. People have an idea, they write it down on a piece of paper, and in this respect, a written Constitution is no different from a barroom napkin, right? They try it for a while, they see how it works. It's not working, and they have to try something different. A little bit of technical assistance from Melissa here, sitting off camera. So part of my interest in the current controversies in reevaluating and analyzing the history of the American Revolution afresh from a new angle, the writing of the Constitution afresh from a new angle, part of it, yes, is in challenging myths and misconceptions about the American Constitution. I am concerned, though, that what I see happening right now in the year 2022 is one set of myths being discarded and people's eagerness to embrace and entrench a new set of myths, frankly, a new set of lies. Just within the last several months, you will have heard this from a cacophony of voices. Innumerable people across the United States of America stood up to proclaim that the right to have an abortion is enshrined in the Constitution. Innumerable voices complain that they are taking away our constitutional rights to have an abortion. and many innumerable people talking about the right to privacy in the Constitution. There is no right to have an abortion in the Constitution. There is no right to privacy in the Constitution. Now, a few months before that, I remember likewise in discussions about Twitter. At certain points, it's been said about YouTube and Facebook, they are taking away our constitutional right to freedom of speech. There's absolutely nothing in your Constitution. I mean, even if you look at the history of newspapers in the United States of America, you might be horrified and terrified to see the extent to which all of this has been in the kind of gray area or Wild West situation of making things up as they go along. By the way, simple question from the audience. Frida is asking, what history of the United States would you recommend? I am recommending exactly the two books that are in the description of this video. So this video, even though it is partly a critique of those two books, it is also an advertisement of those two books. And I'll just say the nature of critique in this field, both books are concise. They have to work within limits. Woody Holton has only so many pages here. And likewise, 13 Clocks, Parkinson wrote a much longer book, and then 13 Clocks is an attempt to make a more concise and popular version, summarizing his research. The formula is much more prolix. One of the ways in which critique works is where I'm pointing to these people and saying, the problem is because you focused on this, you omitted or diminished the significance of that. Where it's not that I'm pointing the finger at them and saying that they're factually wrong, but those differences of emphasis really do matter. So I've already hinted at the fact that we're going to be dealing with gun control here. The big breakthrough that's happening, I mean, it sounds very 2022, and again, this raises questions of how now people are creating new myths about the Constitution and history of the American Revolution. One of the big breakthroughs is just for historians to admit to themselves, genocide really matters. Yeah, we have here's one with a great title, at least, "Surviving Genocide" by Jeffrey Ostler. You like that one? Okay, I'm surprised. Yeah, sorry, I intentionally didn't show that on camera. Yeah, you said it didn't feel it was well written. Anyway, so we have quite a few books here. Melissa was just mentioning some others that are off camera. But yeah, I quote that in my own book. But yeah, that's not one I recommend, just due to quality of writing. Yeah. All right. So this may sound rather shallow and stupid if you just say, well, genocide of indigenous people really matters. The enslavement of Black people really matters. And it might be very easy to dismiss that and say, okay, well, the education I was given in high school textbooks and perhaps in university lectures, I understand that perhaps de-emphasized or omitted the significance of those things. But then nevertheless, now, if you're going to give them new emphasis, a new place of prominence in your retelling of the history, you might think that that doesn't really change much of anything. It profoundly changes. It totally changes our understanding of what happened in the American Revolution. It totally changes our understanding of, for example, the provision of the right to bear arms, the idea that every man or every gentleman would carry a gun in the United States of America at the end of that revolutionary period, those revolutionary wars. So now look, sorry, just returning to this issue of one myth replacing another, one set of lies replacing another. Just as it is possible, like a kind of mass hysteria, it's possible for millions of people to convince themselves that the Constitution promises you the right to have an abortion or promises you a right to privacy, where there isn't one word about that. The authors of the Constitution, nothing like this even occurred to them. It was unimaginable to them that this is what they were writing into the Constitution. Well, on a scale of hundreds of millions of people, Americans have convinced themselves that this is precisely what the Constitution guarantees them. In the same way, all my life, I have heard left of center people, and perhaps some moderate centrists, insisting that the constitutional right to bear arms only pertains to members of the military, and especially the local state level armed forces. And they lean on the fact that it contains this sentence about a well-armed militia. This is the claim. This is the myth. It's contending to become a dominant myth in our understanding or reinterpretation of the Constitution. The claim is that we all made a terrible mistake in thinking that an ordinary private citizen would be able to own and carry arms, that in fact, the framers of the Constitution, the authors of the Constitution, that all they had intended was for the state to have a well-armed militia, that for the state would have its own military, or however you want to think of this, its own gendarmes, and that was all that the Constitution was providing for. Now, that is outrageously, laughably false. And we're left in this situation today where it's sort of one myth against another. And as in the same way that Americans just want to contend with one interpretation versus another in relation to abortion rights, we have one fiction versus another, one myth versus another, one set of lies versus another about the Constitution on the ownership of guns, instead of simply accepting that if you want to change something in the Constitution, the same way the people of Taiwan changed their laws about prostitution back and forth, the same way the people of France changed their laws about prostitution back and forth, you just have to accept that this is a change. This is either a revision or an amendment, or you can tear up your Constitution and write a new one so that it says what you want to say. And again, I really think the most profound and abstract and abstruse thing to accept here or reflect on is that there is no progress. It isn't the case that there was something the founding fathers didn't know, that there was something unknown in 1776, like the nature of tooth decay, that now is known. People in 1776 understood how guns worked, okay? They understood how deadly and dangerous guns were. We'll talk about this a little bit later, right? That was really fully, profoundly understood. And I think you really can't imagine how in those years, let's just say the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, just how much experience with violence these men had, just how much blood they had in their hands. Just as one example, I mean, I'll mention Benjamin Franklin too. I've been reading this detailed biography of Gouverneur Morris. So if you don't know who Gouverneur Morris is, he's one of the most fascinating figures in the American Revolutionary period, American Constitution, and so on and so forth. One of the most fascinating and one of the most important and one of the most forgotten. Even for someone like myself who has read about the history of massacres under communism in China, in Russia, and several of these, someone who's familiar with the violence of the French Revolution, to read in detail about Gouverneur Morris really getting blood on his hands in the American Revolution, really killing people, really looting and pillaging from their political enemies, stealing from Tories, however you want to put it. The street level violence in New York City and Gouverneur Morris's own role in it, that was shocking to me. That was horrifying to me. These men knew violence, and they knew what it was before the American Revolution, and they certainly knew a lot more about it by the end of the American Revolution. Nobody could know more the significance of gun ownership than the authors of the American Constitution. And some of these guys you think of as men of peace, someone like Benjamin Franklin, he had a lot of blood on his hands. He had a lot of very direct experience with violence, with military affairs. And this was really a period of history in which violence, to a much greater extent than is today, it was the domain of amateurs, where they didn't have a professional police force. They didn't have a professional military, or they kind of sort of did sometimes. That's why you talk about these terms like militia and Minutemen. There's a great term. What is a Minuteman? What does that mean? These were farmers and cobblers and, some of them aristocrats like Gouverneur Morris. These are just ordinary men with ordinary jobs who would snatch up their guns and run out at a minute's notice and participate in violence, where the line between professional and amateur was blurred or dotted or didn't exist. Now, sorry, I want to say this also. I have here, it's less impressive than holding up a book, I suppose. I have here printed out on paper. It gives you a sense of how few pages these things are. The Constitution of the State of New York from April 20th, 1777, and the Constitution of New Hampshire, which managed to be written January 1776. So I think that's the first state to actually write a constitution in that period. Now, so if you think it's humanly impossible to do that kind of primary source research, you could download these and print them out. The notion of progress, it's really invidious. It's really distorting, even in just looking at a single stage of political development here. I'm going to try to explain to you several stages of development in the Revolutionary period. In the year 1776, and in the year 1777, when these men wrote these constitutions, what they were doing, even at the level of propaganda discourse, by which I just mean the shallowest, most public, most overt level of what they were doing politically, was not progressive. It was not taking a step forward. It was conservative. It was taking a step back. And this stage of the American Revolution, it really can be understood as a conservative revolution in the following terms. Boston was an incredibly important place politically in this period of time. I mean, today we only think of New York and Los Angeles, Chicago in distant third or something, in this period of time, you cannot exaggerate the importance of Boston and the state of Massachusetts in American political discourse. Okay. The people of Massachusetts, the people of the city of Boston, they had a constitution, both in fact and in their claims about propaganda at the time, right? So as they articulated their own political position, they had a constitution. They had a system of government that was dear to them and precious to them. And that had been taken away by the King of England in what were called the Intolerable Acts. Now, this second point I'm going to come back to later. They had a map of what North America was supposed to be. So, what we now call the 13 colonies, et cetera, et cetera. You get into a lot of anachronisms, even just in describing the geography, as opposed to using the actual terms they used at the time, But anyway, the map of North America, these colonies that would later become separated into the United States and Canada, et cetera, right? They had a clear sense of what the political order was and what the geographic order was. Overnight, with the Intolerable Acts, as they are called, from the British perspective, they were the Tolerable Acts. But anyway, to use a propaganda term, the King of England, with one stroke of the pen, had taken away their constitution, had taken away their system of government, whether you think of that as a democracy, as a republic, or as a kind of mixture of the three, right? That was the original claim, was that this was a mixture of aristocracy, democracy, and monarchy, a hybrid polity, something that goes all the way back to Cicero. And that's a type of rationalization of the British parliamentary system that very much was, shall we say, set in stone. It was very much iterated, defined, examined, and redefined very clearly in the period of the English Civil War. So since the English Civil War, everyone is aware this is what Cicero said, this is what the King of England said, this is what the revolution of that time said, i.e. the revolution that tore down the King of England and put Oliver Cromwell in power. And then this was the hybrid discourse. This was the kind of reconciliation at the end of Oliver Cromwell's reign, after the death of Cromwell, when England reverted to having a monarch. But of course, from their perspective, they maintained or sustained the advantages of Republican government that had been, briefly but violently introduced into the history of England at this time. Okay, so that kind of hybrid Republican ideology. The people of Boston, people of Massachusetts as a whole, right? Their claim was that they already had a constitution that they wanted to go back to, and that the King of England had taken this away from them and had appointed a governor as a kind of dictator, sweeping aside this tradition, what have you. So this is very, very clear if you read the Constitution of New Hampshire, the Constitution of New Hampshire, 1776, Constitution of the State of New York, 1777. This is not presenting you with a new system of government. This is defending and perpetuating their old system of government. What both of these constitutions say again and again is, we are going to go back to the system of government we already had as a colony before this confrontation with the king, before the Intolerable Acts, however you want to put it, right? Now, again, I am not saying, so by the way, there's a very different sense in which Woody Holton's work invites us to reevaluate the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution as a kind of counter-revolution, as a kind of elitist revolution from above instead of being a grassroots democratic revolution from below. There are serious questions here. And I've made other YouTube videos talking about that, right? But by the way, the writing of the Constitution, this is several chapters later in the history of the American Revolution, right? And certainly, sorry, I don't want to misrepresent Woody Holton, but I think one romanticized view that is going to result from this new period of scholarship, research, reevaluation of history. One romanticized view is going to be to imagine that the earlier phase of the revolution was grassroots and pro-democracy, and then the later phase of writing the Constitution was instead elitist, top-down, was this kind of aristocratic counter-revolution, conservative counter-revolution. Well, again, I'm not attributing that view to Woody Holton, but I think that's going to be probably the mainstream response to his work and to this whole generation of new scholars, frankly, working in the same field in the same direction along with him. Well, I've already stated something far more disturbing to you. It's something that overturns the assumptions about progress, which is that at the very first phase, already in 1776, 1777, actually what you're talking about shouldn't be understood as progress, shouldn't be understood as an experiment with a new system of government. If you just read the primary source documents, if you just read the Constitution, which is partly a work of propaganda, right? But it's partly an actual blueprint for how government will operate, right? Like it can only so much of this can be propaganda. To some extent, it has to describe the norms, the laws and bylaws, whatever I want to say, the assumptions whereby government is going to operate. And this is telling you very clearly, no new ideas, no new discovery. We haven't discovered penicillin. We haven't discovered fluoride. We haven't discovered a cure for smallpox. We haven't discovered the scientific nature of malaria. Malaria, it's remarkably late in our history that we figure what malaria actually is, by the way. We have a long history of struggling with the symptoms of malaria and not knowing what it is. There's no scientific breakthrough. There's no new discovery. These state constitutions, before the federal constitution, these are written by men who are saying loud and clear they were happy with the system of government they had before, and they want to go back to it. Now, in order to do that, they had to fight a revolutionary war against the King of England. But what these are telling you very clearly is that they are going to go back to a system where they have the same constitution they had before. They have the whole same legal system they had before, the same courts, the same laws. They have a governor the same way they did before. Before they had a colonial governor. Now they have a colonial governor again, right? They're going to have exactly the same norms and standards and practices in operating, whether you want to call it a parliament or a congress or what have you. This is telling you very clearly, no innovation, no new ideas. And I don't mean to be insulting, but you can read these and really say, no revolution, right? That this is a kind of anti-revolution or counter-revolution. Now, sorry, just to be fair, I want to make this clear. If I had been alive at that time, I can completely understand that I also would want to fight against the intolerable acts of King George. I totally get it. I am not saying in some simplistic way, this was a phony revolution, therefore it shouldn't have happened at all. I really can appreciate what was intolerable about the intolerable acts and why these people rose up in that way. This brings us to the next important point. And yes, all of this is linked to gun ownership and gun control. So again, I wish I could hold up the book in front of you, but 13 Clocks by Parkinson. All right. What Parkinson demonstrates very, very well is this. There is a transition in the year 1775. So every year here really matters, guys. 1774 is not 1775, and 1775 is not 1776. With each passing year, the political context profoundly changes in what would become the United States of America. All right. And the objectives people are working towards and the enemies they're working against completely change. So let's just go back one more year. In 1773, America is basically divided between Tories and Whigs. All right. And the Tory versus Whig discourse, I would say, hasn't fundamentally changed since the end of the English Civil War. So again, I've already alluded to this, but it is very important for understanding the American Constitution. You have a new normal is established. There's a loaded political phrase. At the end of the English Civil War, a new normal is established. New fundamental assumptions about politics, new fundamental assumptions about religion, And the profoundest assumption of all was that England was not going to imitate ancient Rome. England was not going to imitate ancient Greece. That England already had accomplished Cicero's ideal of having a hybrid form of government that incorporated the best elements of democracy along with the best elements of monarchy and aristocracy. Now, what a convenient propaganda claim, right? Obviously, plenty of people at that time could have said, what do you mean you have the best elements of democracy? We have no democracy at all, or we have only a tiny amount of democracy. England had a deeply dysfunctional system of elections and very, very basic assumptions. So I'll give you just one example. I'm not going to launch into a critique of how the British system of parliament worked at that time. The name John Wilkes is very important to know to understand this period of history. And unfortunately, most Americans, if you say John Wilkes, they think of John Wilkes Booth. These are two completely different historical figures from different periods of time. John Wilkes is not John Wilkes Booth. Muhammad is not Muhammad Ali. I was once in the classroom, a history classroom, and there was a girl who was insisting that Muhammad Ali and Muhammad were the same person. It was deeply embarrassing for the teacher and for everyone else in the class. And we kept interrupting, no, that's Muhammad. That's not Muhammad Ali. Those are two different people. Anyway, yeah. Very good-looking girl, too. I've never Googled her to find out what happened to her. But sadly, I think she was one of those women who was too good-looking for her own benefit. And probably her parents and her teachers, everything. She said, you'll be fine. You can be a model. And no one was saying to her, look, kid, keep it straight. Keep your centuries straight here. Anyway, Muhammad is not Muhammad Ali. John Wilkes is not John Wilkes Booth. So I just say the life of John Wilkes and the political changes he managed to make in the British House of Parliament just in the few years immediately before the American Revolution. So he has a long career, but it culminates just before the American Revolution. That shows that most of our assumptions about how Parliament was supposed to operate were completely untrue in England in that period. For example, this might seem ridiculous to you, the right of a journalist to quote something that was said in Parliament. Before this time, before John Wilkes challenged it, the assumption was that all negotiations and discussions within Parliament were secret. No one was allowed to publish them in a newspaper. No one was allowed to quote them. No one in the public was allowed to criticize them. So it was a secret meeting of advisors to the king or cronies to the king. So again, like you might assume that in this period, say the century leading up to the American Revolution, that England had already a robust, well-functioning system of democracy. And no, these were precisely the years when in England, the nature and function of Parliament was being most intensely debated, challenged, and ultimately revised. They did make changes. John Wilkes won, basically. And the idea of how this hybrid democracy would function in the British Isles, this was changing just at this time. And that's very much part of the Whig versus Tory discourse, as I say, carried on both in England and in North America throughout this period. So my point is this. In 1773, you have the Whigs, you have the so-called Sons of Freedom, Sons of Liberty, these groups. Right? You have these different groups of enthusiasts. And you have the Tories debating a set of political questions that have been familiar for many decades, right? Doesn't mean they're boring. If I'd been alive at that time, I'm sure I would have been totally engrossed in those debates. What changes? I'm sorry, I can't hold up the book. I should hold up my cell phone. What changes according to this book? What changes according to 13 Clocks? And I think the book really does prove this in a powerful way. I'll mention his sources and how he proves it. Is that there is a shift from Tory versus Whig to everyone versus the slaves, everyone versus the indigenous people, where political discourse fundamentally changes in terms of us versus them. In the United States of America in 1775, it is no longer a question of, for example, to what extent do you support John Wilkes and his reform of Parliament? To what extent are you enthusiastic about some of the new models of democracy and republics in the world, notably Corsica? Corsica is a big deal in this period. It's very important. It's prefiguring and inspiring the American Revolution. So all that's going on in this discourse. And I think what Parkinson proves in 13 Clocks is that there was this profound shift where the us versus them became white people versus non-white people, that this became a race war, and that completely, shall we say, preempted, silenced the ideological and political debates that had been going on before. That was so powerful and so important, so all-consuming, and throughout all of the 13 colonies, not just in the Deep South, not just in Virginia. Now, so this comes back to one of the leitmotifs of this video. Very often, the differences between historians and the difference between politicians, if you like, in discussing politics as something in the present tense or discussing it in retrospective history, very often the difference between two sides is a difference in emphasis. I mean, to say that we have de-emphasized slavery and genocide against the indigenous people in the retelling and understanding of the American Revolution is an understatement. I mean, the extent to which propaganda, the way this history is taught in high schools, universities, and seemingly respectable textbooks, the extent to which we have been deceiving ourselves and lying to ourselves is impossible to exaggerate. And when we shift the emphasis to recognizing the importance of what can only be called race war, a war between races, right? It's not just a difference in emphasis. It's not about being woke or sensitive or progressive or what have you. It's not just a difference in sentiment. This really does substantively change the facts. It changes the selection of facts we're interpreting. It changes our interpretation of the facts. It changes our understanding, and then our opinions. What we're going to conclude moving forward about what needs to happen next in the United States of America. Now, I've mentioned it very briefly, but again, when you understand this, I'll say a few words about it. It is completely ridiculous to say that a nation that had just at that time been in an intense armed struggle against the indigenous people, against rebellious black slaves, against the British military, right? And against a very nebulous and hard to define enemy within, being the Tories, being the United Empire Loyalists, being the people who remained true to the King of England, right? That was a neighbor to neighbor, street to street, cutthroat fight. People really had blood in their hands. To say that those people did not understand the meaning of the right to bear arms, and that's the mainstream left-wing discourse right now. Just like it's the mainstream left-wing discourse that these guys were pro-abortion or even conceived of the American Constitution as legalizing abortion or legalizing gay marriage, that you can interpret this into a text where this was in no way intended or hinted at in a vague statement about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just ridiculous, right? Now, my claim here is not to say to you, oh, well, these men knew the correct way to design a functioning society, whereas the Japanese just have no clue. All right. The Japanese went through a period of unbelievable violence. World War II, have you heard of it? The level of violence the people of Japan had endured. In case you don't know, from Japan's perspective, World War II is a lot longer than anywhere else in the world because it includes what we call in English the Sino-Japanese War, right? Japan basically had been in a continuous state of imperialist warfare from before the beginning of World War I until the end of World War II. It never stopped. It was one battle after another, and it's not just China. We say the Sino-Japanese War. I've written specifically about the wars between Japan and Russia at this time because Russia goes all the way east to Sakhalin Island and pushing that border back and forth. How much of Sakhalin was going to be Japanese, how much was going to be Russian, the eastern coast of Siberia, and so on. And by the way, Japan also had war with the Germans in this period, and so on and so forth. The control of Qingdao, okay. So Japan went through a period of unbelievable violence. Now, it's a slight simplification to say they came out of that with the attitude that they would become a gun-free society, and indeed a society without an army, right? But you can say the Japanese approach to gun control, right, at the end of World War II is completely fundamentally different from the approach of the United States of America, right? Now, within Europe, there are also contrasting approaches. You can contrast Switzerland to Germany, contrast Switzerland to France, Switzerland to England, right? And you can ask who in the world, either as an ideal or in practice, they're achieving a gun-free society, a society without guns, or with as few guns as possible, right? But again, it would be ridiculous to say the Japanese didn't know what they were doing when they basically banned gun ownership and decided to not have a military, blah, 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 to only have self-defense forces. I'm not going to get into all the hypocrisies entailed by the Japanese constitution, which is still their constitution to this day, this post-World War II constitution, written under American dominion, shall we say, if not outright written by Americans. So Japan has its own history on this issue. Taiwan has its own history. Thailand. There are countries all around the world. And of course, most Americans, their engagement with this issue is very much impoverished by the fact that they're not even willing to look at Canada next door. They're not willing to consider a contrasting history that's absolutely adjacent to them. Babe, if you want to jump in, you can. Yeah.
Recently you talked about Cambodia.
Oh, yeah.
Over there were shootouts.
Oh, yeah.
They also
Yes. No. I mean, it's true. I mean, I've been presuming to talk about wealthy countries here rather than poverty-stricken and third world countries. So this is my knowledge. I used to live in Cambodia as well as studying the history on paper. But to my knowledge, and Cambodia is a small country. Everyone knows each other. To some extent, the government isn't that far removed from people. But there was an incident when a school kid, and I forget how young this kid was, but I remember being a young kid. It wasn't someone who was 18 and in school. I don't know if the kid was 11 or 8, but it was a young kid who was really angry at another kid. And he went to his father's car. And so this was a wealthy family in Cambodia. I forget if they might have had a limousine driver to pick the kid up from school, kind of thing. And he went and he got a gun out of the car door. And he pointed it at the other kid, after school, this kind of situation. And, again, it's little kids who lose their temper. But, he knows he's a rich kid and he knows my father has a gun, or he knows his father has a limousine driver who has a gun, whatever exactly the situation was. And that was a breaking point in Cambodian politics where they're like, whoa, this is the reality of the society we've got here. And then the question of how this would change. But yeah, many societies, the reality they live with is that rich people have guns and poor people have none. And that was certainly what America was reacting against. I mean, this was a Unitarian Universalist notion that everyone's going to have a gun and that this would be a wonderful thing. So, by the way, I have mentioned this before, but if you just look at the Constitution of the state of Maine, many of the founding fathers were still alive when the Constitution of Maine was written. And Thomas Jefferson participated in writing the Constitution of the State of Maine. So I'm just saying it's very much part of the same tradition, the same generation, the same values, the same assumptions about the meaning of words. The Constitution of the State of Maine is really consonant with, it reflects the same assumptions as writing the federal Constitution for the United States of America. Again, some of the same people involved. And it wasn't an attempt at innovation. That's also worth saying. It wasn't trying to be new and different. It was just carrying on the same tradition. And the Constitution of the State of Maine, from memory, I believe the wording is, it simply says, every man has the right to bear arms, to own guns, to own firearms, and absolutely nobody will ever question it. Close quotes. And nobody can ever question it. It's an unquestioned right for individuals to bear arms. So anyway, look, my point is this. There's nothing inevitable about the experience of violence on this massive scale. And again, it's not just huge in scale, it's also very intimate violence. I can say more about this, but this book that I can't, 13 Clocks, it really shows you there were white people who were fighting against their own former servants, like black people who slept in the same house with them, where the black people slept downstairs and the white people commit kind of violence, this kind of race war. There were owners of farms, of estates, whatever you want to say, where suddenly the white people were in a state of war against their farm workers, which is something they had certainly been terrified of for many years leading up to this. It wasn't a possibility they had never imagined. However, what they had never imagined was that their slaves would be armed by the King of England to fight against them and massacre them. That was beyond their worst nightmares. They had been prepared for and afraid of a slave uprising, a slave rebellion. But this was a slave uprising, a slave rebellion, armed by, encouraged by, funded by the King of England himself. So you're saying this is violence that's not only enormous in scale, but it's door-to-door violence. It's within your house. It's on your city block, your farm, your forest. It was violence everywhere. Now, again, Japan at the end of World War II had just lived through a period of tremendous violence. There isn't some kind of simple cause and effect relationship where the experience of violence results in a resolution like the American Constitution or the Constitution of the state of Maine, so on and so forth, right? You could have that experience of violence and instead become a society that's very controlling of munitions, armaments, etc. But I'm just saying, you have to respect and take seriously, this was the American response, right? Their response to the experience of race war in this period, because there was, you can go back to Christopher Columbus in the 1490s. There are many different discrete periods where you're talking about genocidal war and wars of whites against blacks and slave uprisings, so on and so forth. Obviously, immediately prior to the American Revolution, you can look at the island of Haiti. The revolution of Haiti kind of goes on forever. It's both before and after and during. Haiti, things are rough for more than a century there. It's a long, long history. Babe, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, part of the reason why I was mentioning the Bernard Bailyn book, The Barbarous Years, is because he does talk about these interactions between the colonists and the native people. So I just think that's also important to read that history where in the 1600s, that there were just constantly conflicts going on. And this did inform, the writing of these constitutions, that they are aware this is always a threat. This is always something that they're terrified of. And that's part of the reason why it's been written into the Constitution.
Right. Yeah. Well, what I would say with that, so she's shouting out again a book called The Barbarous Years by Bailyn. And that author, Bernard Bailyn, he was really famous for his work as a young man. He kind of had hit books that were very influential. And this is him writing as an old man. It's at the end of his career that he writes The Barbarous Years. The world as Woody Holton presents or represents it, the world as Woody Holton perhaps misrepresents it, he very much presents to us the conclusion that the period of the American Revolutionary War was the final period in which the indigenous people were a serious armed threat, where they really had the chance to fight and win against the white man, to simplify, against American colonists. Now, so look, again, I'm not saying that's untrue, but what I would emphasize is this: for the white people who were alive at that time and who were writing the American Constitution, they did not know it was the final period. For them, that situation, which again is, so in this period of time, my point is, if you're talking about California in the 19th century, it's totally different. If you're talking about Hawaii, like, it was not the case that white people in Hawaii were afraid, which is centuries later, right? It wasn't the case that there was this kind of ongoing armed conflict where white people thought they were going to be murdered in their sleep by the indigenous people. But yeah, in talking about Bernard Bailyn's The Barbarous Years, leading up to the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, there is this long period where the indigenous people, from the perspective of the white colonists, they have the numbers, they have the armaments, and they have the level of organization to really be a serious threat, to really end their colonies, to wipe them out. Right. And where the white people, again, including Benjamin Franklin literally went on the warpath of hunting and killing indigenous people. He was directly involved with that. He was pulling triggers and marching with Minutemen, whatever you want to say, marching with armed volunteers to go out and fight against the indigenous people. So, again, it just makes it very palpable. This wasn't something they studied in a university classroom on a chalkboard. Ben Franklin had blood on his hands. He knew the smell of gunpowder. He knew what it was to go out and fight the indigenous people. I'm not glorifying it. I'm saying this was their physical reality. So yeah, I just say it's very easy to look back at that anachronistically and say, okay, well, this was the final period in which the indigenous people were a threat. And then after that, we get into a long period of history where white people completely dominate the continent, militarily, economically, and politically, where there really aren't two voices in the dialogue. But it's true to say, on the one hand, yeah, we just need to emphasize that the genocide had been going on since Columbus. Yes. But then I think the other thing I'd say is that this was also a long period where the genocide had real negotiations, where there were two sides negotiating peace treaties. And so, is that the emphasis you bring to it, or no? What?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I just want to say the reason why I'm mentioning that book is because in Surviving Genocide, I don't feel like there's as much emphasis on these bloody conflicts, like these, just these conflicts that were going on. And also just in what I was taught in my education, I was told, how horrific that the genocide was in the history of the United States, but not so much about the Native response, that they also were armed and that they also were a threat.
Right, that up to this period, there were very much two sides to the conflict, that they are fighting back, and there's the prospect of them winning.
I think you mentioned when we were talking about, I don't know if it was in 13 Clocks, but just in exchange for a weapon, Native people agreed to fight in the counter-revolutionary.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So just
anyway, yeah. Look, sorry, I don't know if I want to get into the history of that. Who were the indigenous people and what motivated them, and what were they fighting for? For the purposes of this video, I want to say this. Probably your high school textbooks about World War II, your high school textbooks about the Holocaust, about a very different genocide, probably your high school textbooks included some explanation of, some reflection of the extent to which Germans, whether this is sane or insane, Germans blamed the Jews for having let them down in World War I. Now, I think this is a very minor part of the history of Nazi ideology, but there is truth to it. So again, this is an issue where the dispute is about emphasis, not about facts. All of the accounts of the Nazi period, World War II genocide period that I read, whether in high school or university, the accounts that were given to me as opposed to the research I did independently, they always emphasized this, that the Germans had a feeling that they could have won in World War I if they weren't let down by their own side, by kind of the peace protesters on their own side. And the feeling that the Jewish population, as this more cosmopolitan pro-peace, that there were some number of Jewish people marched in anti-war protests and so on, that this was part of what let their side down in World War I. Now, by the way, I've made other YouTube videos talking about the history of Nazi ideology. I think that is I think that is a tiny part of the history of Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism in Germany. I think it's ridiculous to give that the emphasis that textbooks regularly do. But nevertheless, even if it is a pea rather than a cantaloupe in its size and significance in this history, you can see the way that we're construing history there is to try to convey a psychological motive whereby the German people, whether this be rational or irrational, whether this be sane or insane, felt that they were getting revenge against an ethnic minority among them who had been on the other side in World War I. That's how we're construing history. Now, again, I've stated repeatedly, I disagree with this interpretation, but I understand how it makes a coherent and compelling narrative out of the interwar years, the wars in between World War I and World War II. So I'm sorry, if your textbooks didn't teach it to you this way, that's fine. I have a video that has occult in the title, The Occult Origins of Nazi Ideology. And that really gives you a sense of just how insane the Nazis were. And I think in writing a rational history, kind of by definition, we're diminishing the irrational aspects of history. We're rationalizing history, whether we want to or not. So that's, anyway, you can watch a separate video on that. You can think about what I've said about that if you want to. I'm mentioning this here as a kind of allegory to clarify what I'm trying to say about the American Revolution. How much more intense was the racism at that time in 1776, right? Like, can you imagine the intensity of the racism, given that what had just happened was that the King of England had armed the black slaves and the indigenous people, the native people, had armed them to fight against the white colonists, right? Can you imagine a scenario in which during World War I, it's incomprehensible. What if during World War I, the King of Germany, I realize there wasn't a king of Germany at this time. It's just anachronistic in various ways. But just imagine hypothetically, if the king of Germany had armed the Jews to fight against the Germans within his own country. It's surreal. It's incomprehensible. How much more intense would the anti-Semitism have been? How much more intense would the genocide have been in response to that, right? So my point is this. Whatever state Americans were at in 1773 and even 1774 in their discourse on race, their discourse on the abolition of slavery, right? This was profoundly changed the moment guns were being put in the hands of African-American people, enslaved people. Guns were being put in the hands by the King of England, right, to fight against white Americans. Now, the issue with indigenous people, native people, in some ways it's different, but in some ways it's worse. Everyone was prepared for the possibility of a slave uprising. As I said before, nobody was prepared for the King of England himself employing the slaves as his minions in fighting against the white colonists. That was worse than the worst nightmare that the slave-owning class of society could have, or any of the white people who lived in what had been, in some ways an integrated society. Just people were living in communities where the blacksmith was ethnically black. And again, you have to remember, not all black people were slaves. There were also freedmen. There were black people who were not slaves, who owned different kinds of small businesses. Their political rights were drastically worse than a white person. But there were liberated black people who were also an important part of society. And indeed, that even comes up in these slave rebellions. They're very often led by a free black leading enslaved blacks to rebel and get their own freedom and so on. So I just say the significance of the free blacks within racially bifurcated slave societies is also very important. Anyway, so that's that side of the equation. The indigenous people had been employed in one war after another as mercenaries by all of the European powers. So that was what everyone was accustomed to, right? So everyone was accustomed to the idea that when there was a war with Spain, the Spanish monarchy would try to arm, recruit, and even kind of bribe indigenous people with some kind of promise or some kind of payment. And what Melissa was mentioning, as soon as the payment was the guns themselves, was just giving them rifles, giving them guns, because they were valuable and useful objects. But there might be no payment other than the armament, saying, hey, look, we will give you these guns if you agree to fight against the British colonists or whatever. Everyone was accustomed to the idea that the French would arm indigenous people to fight against the English. The Spanish would arm indigenous people to fight against the English and the French, so on and so forth. What was shocking and horrifying about this is this time the target is us. If you were living in a place like Boston or a place like New York, still to this day, New York is walking distance from Montreal. I mean, it's a long walk, but I know we think of these things as far apart. Think about an army that just has to march from Montreal to New York City. Of course, New York State is even closer, the border of New York State. These things are not far off. Okay, the very familiar pattern of the indigenous people being used as mercenaries now was being used against the white colonists. So again, to say this is a difference merely in emphasis in the interpretation of history, right? Obviously, we're completely misrepresenting history when we diminish this. Okay, so this is what I want to say. This is now my critique. This is the portion we're going to criticize both Woody Holton and 13 Clocks by Parkinson. And it's a further difference in emphasis. And again, making the very significant caveat, these men, they've tried to be concise. They're not telling the entire history of everything from Alpha to Omega. And again, many of the other books I have in this stack are so enormous. Yeah, right, yeah. Anyway, so what is this? The Framers' Coup, which I don't recommend. There's over 800 pages. So partly concision is part of the problem, I understand. And then we're going to come back to this question of gun ownership and the amendment of the American Constitution. If you have a moment now, hit the thumbs up button. Sorry, I meant to say at the very beginning of this video, if you guys have something to say, if you have a question to ask about the regulation of munitions in the United States of America, the regulation of gun ownership. Think about it now and kind of ask, because I'm going to enter into this critique of the history of the Revolution and writing the Constitution, and then I'm going to return to the discussion of gun ownership. So you don't have to type it right now, but rub the sticks together and come up with an intelligent question. I will return to that, and again, you can ask it now, and I'll scroll up, or you can ask it when the time comes. Toward the end of this portion of the video, that's a critique. I think it's really easy to lose sight of the importance of the intolerable acts with this new emphasis, with the focus, the analytical framework brought to the history. And they are two very different authors, by the way, by Woody Holton and by Parkinson. Again, partly this is just chronological. The intolerable acts, they matter. They're tremendously important, but for a short period of time. And I'm saying this because I find convincing the argument in 13 Clocks that after a certain point, the race war completely takes over and dominates the American mind, the American imagination. And again, the disputes that used to exist of Tory against Whig, the philosophical debates that very much were rooted in Oliver Cromwell's period of dictatorship and republicanism in England, all of that fades into the background. We can't quite say it's forgotten. But frankly, the parlor room discussion of the ideal constitution that John Adams very much engages in for hundreds and hundreds of pages, right? That really doesn't matter anymore with this turning point in 1775. What utterly matters, what's totally animating everyone, again, not just in Virginia, even in the far north, is this race war discourse, war against enslaved Black Americans, war against Indigenous people. Okay, here's my problem with that. We have to take seriously, what was it about the intolerable acts that really was intolerable, that lit the fuse for this war, and I feel informed and shaped the successive stages of Civil War, Revolution, and writing of the Constitution. Now, I am a very eccentric political philosopher in that if you make a list of what was supposedly intolerable about the intolerable acts, 8 out of 10 points on that list, I think, are bullshit. And, bullshit can be an important part of history. Bullshit, like propaganda, matters too. And you can examine it and analyze it. But a lot of this stuff, you have to say, was just bullshit. It was just propaganda. So I'll give you a great example. Did you know that there was a popular theory among the Nazis that they were direct descendants of Atlantis and Lemuria? This, you can look into just how crazy it was. It was bullshit. Hate to break this to you. The German people are not the descendants of ancient Atlantis or something. You can look at some things in politics that maybe they mattered. They mattered to what extent, but they were different. Japanese politics is actually really, really surreal that way, too, by the way. I'm sorry, if you look at the history of Japan, just really crazy, including, it was very, very popular, the belief in Japan that Jesus Christ visited Japan, that the historical Jesus went, oh, yeah. That's a thick book in the library, okay? You want to get into Japanese Christian literature about, the Buddha. Sorry, well, it's true. I was going to say both. Both Jesus Christ physically going to Japan and the Buddha physically going to Japan, and that kind of mythos. So one is there can be completely ahistorical notions that are complete bullshit that may be important at one period of time. Sometimes bullshit matters. When I'm looking at the intolerable acts, my fundamental point is maybe 8 out of 10 are tolerable. And we are just looking at very insincere propaganda from the Whigs, from the Sons of Freedom, Sons of Liberty, trying to put together a rationalization for, a rebellion that would ensue, but for very different reasons. This is my take on this. So again, some of those issues, some of those questions, they were very familiar for decades. They weren't new, they weren't sudden, they weren't unexpected, and they've been rehearsed at least since the English Civil War, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but when you're looking at the intolerable acts, what is new? What is different? And I feel every single book I've ever read about the American Revolution. Every single book I've read about the Constitution completely misses the significance of this. Okay. What was new, what was different, what was intolerable was the Quebec Act. Every single version of the history I've ever encountered, including in high school, takes the position that at this time there was a regrettable sort of racism against Catholics, that, the Protestants were just kind of bigoted. So really, for no good reason at all, people were hostile toward the idea of the King of England recognizing the Catholic Church within Quebec. It creeps in this way as a footnote to a footnote of the history of the revolution. And what I have to say is, you are dead wrong. Like, the depth of misinterpretation, misrepresentation, misconception there, we have to really take seriously. And the Quebec Act and what it meant to anyone alive in the 13 colonies at that time, right? It's astonishing. It's breathtaking. It's intolerable. It's enough alone to make you get up and take arms and fight against the King of England, to fight against the king whom you had been loyal to just 6 months before or just 3 months before. Like, before, we were just having this kind of endless, decades-long debating party about what is the ideal constitution. And again, John Adams is an example of this, and so on. You have these guys who are kind of sitting around saying, well, we have the legacy of Oliver Cromwell. There was certainly a huge fashion for reading historians of ancient Rome. Athens became more popular later. A lot of the interest was in Rome. There was a lot of interest in Sparta in this period. Yeah, Rome and Sparta, not Athens, for whatever strange reason. Let's sit around and kind of reflect on what is the ideal constitution, what is the role of democracy inside. That was going on. Okay, what the Quebec Act showed on an enormous scale, I'm going to try to describe this, was the same thing that the abrogation of the Constitution of Massachusetts, the replacement of the system of government in Boston, showed on a tiny scale. With one stroke of the pen, the King of England had wiped out and overturned everything that Englishmen in America had been fighting for, not just in the 7 Years' War, what some people still call the French and Indian War, but everything they'd been fighting for going back to Oliver Cromwell and the English Revolution. Okay, so the Quebec Act suddenly, radically redraws the map of North America. And again, I've only ever seen this admitted as a kind of funny footnote to history. It's like, oh yeah, isn't it a funny thing? Actually at this time, at the same time that these exciting, important things were happening in America, like at the same time that the Boston Tea Party happened, like that's where all the emphasis is this, the Boston Tea Party is treated as being of such tremendous significance. The King of England drew a new map of the continent that indescribely expanded the territory of Quebec. And guys, you can look it up on Wikipedia, what this was, what the Quebec Act would have. All of a sudden extends the territory of Quebec all the way west to the part of North America that's dominated by Spain still, the Spanish North America. It's not just the Ohio Valley. It's the whole Great Lakes area, all coasts of we got 7 Great Lakes, right? All 5 of the Great Lakes, every coast, north, south, east, and west. This is completely gobbled up by Quebec. And what does it do with the government of Quebec? It wipes out the progress. I mean, I'm critical of the concept of progress, but the progress people were committed to. This idea that we'd made progress toward a hybrid system of government, of parliaments. Yes, there's some role for the aristocrats, some role for the king, but you have parliaments, you have democracy, you have transparency, you have accountability. The progress that so many people had fought and died for, to have separation of church and state. I will say for the 1000th time, they did not have perfect separation of church and state. They had extremely imperfect separation of church and state. But if you were comparing the Dark Ages to what England had after Oliver Cromwell, after the English Civil War, it was a huge step forward, and it made life possible for the Puritans. It made life possible for the Quakers. It made life possible for the, what was the word? The non-consenting denominations. They had a special term for this. I'm sorry. But anyway, for unconventional, dissident forms of Christianity to exist, which was exactly what had been so intensely persecuted throughout the Dark Ages. So no, the amount of religious freedom, even for Catholics, even for Jews, let alone for African slaves, the amount of religious freedom for indigenous people, like there are tremendous hypocrisies here. But from the perspective of someone alive at that time, they would say, what have we been fighting for all these centuries? Just to have the King of England reverse all of it with one stroke of the pen, to totally redraw the map of North America. It changed what had been known as the Free State Line, the land that was allotted for the indigenous people. It massively expanded Quebec. And what was the new system of government created in this Quebec? I mean, we can't even call it Quebec, but this massive expansion of Quebec to be a huge part of the continent. It was going to be absolutely zero democracy. There was going to be one governor assigned as a dictator by the King of England, and he was going to work with the Catholic Church, who would again be allowed to collect tithes. They would return to the system of religion that had existed since the Dark Ages. All right. Now, there's an even darker part of this history, which certainly matters to the history of Canada a great deal. The enormity of Quebec, and this all being a return to dictatorship out of the Dark Ages. What was north of Quebec was even worse. That was so-called Rupert's Land. That was going to be corporate rule. Again, no democracy. The King of England works with the Hudson Bay Company, works with a for-profit corporation to make as much money as possible, exploiting the indigenous people, exploiting the natural resources. What happened to the hybrid system of government that, again, even if you think it's only 5% democracy, whether you think it's 5% or 50%, it's a matter of opinion. Right? What happened to the parliamentary system of government we fought so hard for? And that, again, in some ways is old news because the English Civil War feels a long time ago. But in some ways, it's brand new. We all just lived through the drama of John Wilkes. We all just lived through the struggle for the reform and, improvement of democracy in England. The reform of, this was really the golden era of the idea of freedom of the press, the idea of public participation in democracy, the idea that we now completely take for granted of what a parliament is supposed to be, so on and so forth, right? So of all the intolerable acts, the most intolerable of all was the Quebec Act. And there was a vision for the future of North America there, which was, again, it was so horrifying, it was so shocking that I can say, if I were alive at that time, I would suddenly want to take up arms against the King of England and fight. And this is a stage, as I say, prior to the race war discourse taking over, the war against blacks, the war against indigenous people, so on and so forth. And it's interesting to me because the significance of the Quebec Act, I feel like it was forgotten by the old version of history. And I think it is still being forgotten by the new version of history, the new analysis, the new approach to the history that's being retold now by people like Woody Holton and Parkinson and 13 Clocks. So you say a little bit more about 13 Clocks now. So we have someone who's obviously incredibly stupid in the audience. And I think he's trying to get himself banned. So shout out to Iowa X in the audience. Iowa X says, quote, "Armed slaves were ineffective at best and a minor footnote in the American Revolution." Close quote. I don't think you've read one book on this topic. I don't think you've read one Wikipedia article on this topic. You don't know what you're talking about. And the book you need to read, it's not that long a book. I forget if it's 200 pages, 250 pages. The book you need to read is 13 Clocks. All right. That is the book. And the link is in the description. So I'm sorry, you are factually wrong. And the idea that armed slaves were a minor footnote in the American Revolution, that may be a lie your school teachers told you. It may be a lie you read in a textbook, like in a seemingly respectable textbook. And it may be a lie you made up in your own mind. Like, I don't know where you got that from. All right. That is utterly untrue. Now, I'm going to mention this briefly. So I'm saying this partly to promote 13 Clocks. And I'm saying this partly as a critique of 13 Clocks. The main source 13 Clocks works from are the newspapers throughout the 13 colonies, throughout the New World. I don't know if he included, newspapers from, say, Montreal. It's mostly about, what would become the United States of America. That's all. Did he include newspapers from, say, Jamaica? I've seen a few quotes from Jamaica in the book, because they just say before America achieves independence, the 13 colonies are very much part of one empire, with places like Kingston, Jamaica, and Montreal, and so on and so forth. But anyway, he read every page of every newspaper for a period of something like 15 years leading up to the American Revolution. Now, he says this himself in interviews. In case that sounds like an enormous amount of reading, part of his research was to track this. The reality was, like, one newspaper in Philadelphia would publish a certain article, and then it would be reprinted verbatim a few weeks later or a month later in Virginia, in Boston, so on and so forth. So if he was looking at, say, 25 newspapers, it wouldn't be that time consuming, because absolutely the same article would appear again and again. So he would have read it once, and then when he started again, he'd actually check to see if there were changes. Sometimes there were changes, right? Like sometimes something he points out is, oh, the newspaper in Philadelphia took exactly the same article, but they put this part in italics, and they added just one sentence about how terrible it's was. So he actually notices the changes too. So this gives you, anyway, just say this is a really robust empirical basis for the conclusions he's drawing. Now, I'm about to criticize it. But the sense of fear of having the slaves rise up, the slaves being armed in your town, in your village, that is recorded very well by those local newspapers. And it's not just in the Deep South. It's not just in South Carolina, et cetera, in the Carolinas, or whatever example you want to use, a place that stereotypically has a lot of slavery. Now, so to give an example, in Virginia, the royally appointed governor, so the king's governor, the governor who's working for the King of England, he set out a proclamation, and you can read the primary source text now. You can read the actual wording he uses. He put out a proclamation that declares all of the slaves free, and then invites them, if they're able-bodied, to come and be armed and fight for the king. Now, the wording is intentional. All right. Now, by the way, this is my own observation. This is actually not in 13 Clocks, and it's not in Woody Holton's book also. He does not say, as one of the emperors of Rome would say, he doesn't say, if you sign up and join the army and fight for 5 years, then as a reward, we will give you freedom. It is not this kind of contractual phrasing. It declares all of the Negroes free. It declares all black slaves free. And then there's a comma, and able-bodied black slaves are invited to join in the king's struggle against the revolution. Okay. This was the most terrifying, the most transformative proclamation the governor of Virginia could have possibly made. And I think 13 Clocks does a very good job of contextualizing it, that he was just he was in a desperate position, in a desperate situation. He was sleeping on a boat every night. I assume they during the daytime they got out and walked around on land a bit. But he was operating his government from a small boat on the coast of Virginia, because there was no city where he was safe sleeping at night, because of the fear that these American revolutionaries would burn his house down, would capture him, so on and so forth. So he was in a very real state of peril. Yes, the slave uprisings mattered, right? They had a galvanizing, terrifying effect on the white colonists of North America. And I can say, we can't say coast to coast in this period, from north to south. All right. Now, yes, by the way, the worst case scenario for that kind of slave revolution, they already knew about from the history of Haiti. They knew how far it could go. They knew what slaves were capable of. To what extent the slaves knew that is another question. Okay. But this was not a slave rebellion. These were slaves being offered freedom in exchange for killing white people with the full legal support, financial support of the King of England. That's something very different from just a slave uprising or slave rebellion. It's slaves being encouraged to rebel and rise up, right, while being a mercenary for the King of England, being assured you will be given impunity You will not be put on trial. It's not like if you engage now in murder, raping, and looting, that later you'll fear going to prison. The King of England is telling you that he's going to give you impunity. He's going to give you armaments. He's going to give you guns to rise up. Now, 13 Clocks is an interesting book in many different ways. One of the things this book draws attention to again and again is the total hypocrisy of the white colonist side, who are simultaneously preaching a revolution in the name of freedom, preaching a revolution so that they themselves will not be slaves. They're talking about their own liberty. And at the same time, like sometimes in the same newspaper, but sometimes in the same article, in the same paragraph, they're pointing the finger at the slaves and saying how terrible it is that they're fighting for their liberty, they're fighting for their freedom. Now, I want to make a very quick contrast here. Who the hell would fight a war because of the Boston Tea Party? Who is going to fight a war because they don't want to pay taxes on tea? And what do the taxes pay for? They pay for the British Navy, which makes it possible to export tea from India to Boston. Like, it is very obvious why Americans need to pay taxes on tea, especially on things that are imported and exported across this globe-spanning empire that the British had created. It costs a lot of money. And yeah, taxes on tea make sense. Americans should pay taxes on tea. To fight because you don't want to pay taxes on tea, this is a really thin pretext for revolution. The black people of America, the slaves of America, they were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for their survival. They were fighting for something very real and very palpable. What they were fighting for, their passion, their purpose, there's no comparison between what motivated, what fueled, the slaves in the American Revolution. All right, so did you want to say something? Yeah.
Just want to say, as an American, yes, it was my experience learning about the American Revolution that most of the emphasis was on the Boston Tea Party. Most of the emphasis was on the independence of the American colonies from England.
Yes.
So it's just, I think this 13 Clocks book and this live stream is extremely important for Americans to hear, because I do think it puts things in a very different context when you see it as slaves fighting for their liberty, that this was on offer, you know, that this was what they could potentially have gotten from fighting for the counter-revolutionary forces, that was the most terrifying thing of all, not being under the dominion of the King of England, but, you know, this fear that there would be this uprising of, you know, and just, this wasn't emphasized, you know, of course, in my textbooks and in, you know, classroom lectures, they did talk about slavery, the, you know, evils of slavery, but just, you know, thinking of what society was like at that time, just the constant tension, constant, you know, fear that was going on. Yeah, I do think that's, it's just a very stupid comment from that person. You know?
Well, no, I understand, but what he's reflecting is the propaganda that most of us were raised with. I mean, his way of putting it, he said the slave uprisings were a minor footnote. Well, you were probably taught the revolution in Haiti was a minor footnote too. Like, you probably were taught the Haitian Revolution didn't matter. I mean, maybe taught all kinds of things, as opposed to saying, no, this really mattered. This really influenced the history of the world. You know, I would say too, there's a relatively long history in these colonies and in Europe generally also of offering freedom to the slaves on the other side who will fight for your side. So it wouldn't have been inconceivable to them that, you know, for example, when the British tried to conquer Haiti, which they did, they failed, you know, that in trying to conquer a place like that the British would say, okay, we will give freedom to the slaves that fight on our side against the French, or in some other context against the Spanish. But this was uniquely horrifying. It was inconceivable that, for example, the governor of Virginia, and he wasn't the only one, that throughout the 13 colonies, that the British Empire, that the king himself would offer freedom to the slaves in order to fight against white Englishmen, people who had been English. That was so uniquely horrifying and terrifying about that. But however, it's true. I mean, even at the best of times, this was a society of armed slave owners who literally had to watch the powder keg. They had to watch where the gunpowder was stored, to prevent it being taken by the slaves, to prevent slaves capturing munitions, capturing gunpowder, and being able to raise up their own flag in rebellion and fight for their own freedom. And by the way, that's a discourse in terms of all these guys who grew up with ancient Roman literature, whether that's from Plutarch or Polybius or what have you. Polybius is both Greek and Roman in effect. Anyway, another story. But whether ancient Greece or ancient Rome, but especially with ancient Rome, you know, the idea of slave rebellion and of class struggle, you know, between the patrician class and the poor, the plebs and the slaves and so on. Yeah. That was something they were also completely prepared for by their neoclassical education. The idea that the slaves are at any given time trying to rise up and tear your society down. That's written into the predominantly Latin texts, but to some extent Greek texts that at that time were worshipped. And it really is especially Plutarch. Plutarch's Lives is probably the most popular, the most widely read and enjoyed of those texts. And that's rehearsed there again and again, that idea that the lower orders of society are trying to tear down the patrician class, the aristocrats, the privileged, the wealthy, however you want to think of this. And again, you see that that's very much what consumes John Adams and the other people who were in the kind of constitutional debating society in the years that follow.
Yeah, I don't want to get too off topic, but I will just say the part of what is discussed in Woody Holton's book is about the financial aspect.
Yes, right.
And the fact that, you know, it just, you know, it's putting the pieces together for me. And I really do appreciate this. Not only the book, but your discussion on this, because when I was younger, I just kind of took it as a fact that it was like, oh, well, these acts were intolerable, the Stamp Act and, you know, this kind of thing. But, you know, they were left in a much worse financial situation after the Revolutionary War. That's right. For decades that followed. So, you know, and the amount of funds that were required for this war, you know, it seems
right. Well, I'd say that too. I think as with rationalizations for the reasons for World War II, for what the Nazis did in that period. Well, actually, this is even more true of World War I. But anyway, people often want to impose a rational economic motive on history. And there has been a lot of that in the understanding of the American Revolution and then later the writing of the American Constitution. And yes, that's one of the most important contributions of Woody Holton, is to say, no, economically, this does not make sense. And here's the reality of what was going on economically instead. Yeah, that's a very, very powerful revelation from Woody Holton. But likewise, I'm saying something different here. This is not really the period Holton talks about. It's not his interest. I'm saying when you're looking at 1774, 1775, this period when these tremendous changes are happening, you can't make sense out of this economically in this way. As you've said, it's not the case that there's some kind of dry calculation of, oh, well, look how much we're spending on taxes when we buy tea. Yeah. We'll get a better deal if we regicidally rebel against the king. And again, keep in mind, this is the same king you were fighting with shoulder to shoulder. This is the British crown. You fought for king and country against the French in the 7 Years' War. I mean, not everyone alive. Some people were born so, you know, but the vast majority of men who were old enough to engage in political debates, including Benjamin Franklin and so on, all of them remembered the 7 Years' War. They remember fighting with the King of England against the French, and as people say, against the French and Indians. Now you are fighting with the French. The American revolutionaries entered into an alliance with the French, with the King of France against England, right? So do you understand the type of treason, the type of betrayal, the type of reversal within one man's lifetime? I mean, like, again, within Benjamin Franklin's lifetime, were generally any of these people, if you weren't a teenager right at that moment, you know, some people were, but anyone who was middle-aged, let alone elderly or something, as these political events unfolded, the depth of that treason, the depth of that betrayal to fight against the King of England in an alliance with the French, and also they're in an alliance with the Spanish, to work with the Spanish monarchy and the French monarchy against the King of England. What moves you to that level of commitment? My answer is it's not the tax on tea. It's not. Like that when you look at the intolerable acts, it's the Quebec Act that's really intolerable. And then, as I say, I do think this is this important clarification that after the period where the intolerable acts matter, then we move into this period of race war, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. There are many. So I'm going to now again enter into this little bit of a critique of 13 Clocks. There are many elements of the book that are touching to me. And one of them, again, recognizing this, that in history there is no progress. If you guys have a second, hit the thumbs up. By the way, we have 37 people in the audience. It'd be great if we can have 37 thumbs up. Helps people discover the video later and so on. It will help people join the conversation right now, in theory. Okay, I'll enter into the critique first. I would just say it's a little bit emotionally touching to me, for example, when 13 Clocks reflects on the fact that the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, it came and went in popularity. It's so obvious. Anyone who reads history in enough detail, that you want to believe that it's like a scientific discovery. It's like discovering the light bulb, that it's like discovering penicillin, it's like discovering fluoride or something. And it's not. Oh yeah, for a couple of years here, everyone thought they were about to abolish slavery and there was this really clear sense of purpose. And then, it went out of style for 20 years. And then, then it became in fashion later. And then 30 years after that, when you really are reading primary source history, that the interest in the abolition of slavery comes and goes, right? And I feel that you do get a sense, emotionally as well as factually, that just a few years before the American Revolution, say 1773, there was tremendous enthusiasm for the abolition of the slave trade and for greater equality between blacks and whites, put it that way, that there was. And by the way, some participants in the American Revolution were part of that tendency. The main one I want to mention is Benjamin Rush. So Benjamin Rush is forgotten today. So is Governor Morris. So are all these people. But there were some people. Benjamin Rush, he was a medical man. He was a medical doctor of his time. And he completely committed to the position that black people and white people were biologically equal, that they were equal in intelligence and that the physical differences were trivial. Like they differed in their complexion, but this was not, he was really ahead of his time on that. And, by contrast, take a look at what Thomas Jefferson's attitudes were towards black people. You want to really be horrified. This is a terrible book this is a terrible book written by a terrible person about a terrible person. I do not recommend this book, but for various reasons, it's a hilarious example to hold up here. Anyway, yeah, so there were some people involved in the American Revolution who were ahead of their time, but there were a whole lot who were behind the time. And it is not the case that there was an unambiguous unidirectional progress towards abolition. I'm glad to see Oliver is in the audience. I meant to tell Melissa to note down the time when I switch between topics here. I will, when this video is over, sometime in the next few days, I will add a table of contents so that people can find this video. And I'm going to send this video to Woody Holton. I'm going to send it to the author of 13 Clocks, to Parkinson. I'll invite them to see the video, because those guys, they don't have a whole lot of YouTube videos and podcasts discussing their work. I hope they appreciate hearing the discussion. But I can imagine also they might want to just click on the timestamp. Oh, this is the part where he criticizes me. Okay. All right. So look, I've mentioned the strength of the empirical basis for the approach in 13 Clocks. And actually, Melissa very efficiently mentioned the strength of Woody Holton's approach also, which is economic, so to speak. Obviously, it's both politics and economics, but this is really a new revelation in the approach to the economics of the period that Woody Holton brings to it. And I've made other YouTube videos discussing that in depth in the past. There is a reciprocal weakness with either of these men. And I think I can ask anyone in the current generation pushing the interpretation of American Revolution and Constitution into direction, with any of this current generation of new authors. How often do you see quoted the perspective of the King of England himself? Now, I am not saying this because I support the King of England or sympathize with his perspective, but you've done all this work with the primary sources, getting the voices of the people who were actually there in the massacre. You know what I mean? People who were there with their muskets, you're getting really first-person perspective on this history on the American side. But that's not the only side. And I've said in earlier videos, a big part of this shift in our understanding of what happened is just the digitization of archives. That before, it was very difficult physically to go through and read all these texts. Now, increasingly, through the internetization of all things, the things being scanned and computerized, it's become much easier to find what you want to read and to survey and look through a huge pile of documents. Back when I was a scholar of Buddhism, I did that all the time. I did work with paper, but you have a huge corpus of text from ancient Buddhism, and be able to see like, how many times is slavery mentioned or something? You could go through and look at the parts about slavery. So our ability to do that is increasing worldwide. Okay, well, guess what? The archives of private letters between founding fathers in America, the archives of newspapers published in the Revolutionary period in America, right? Those aren't the only archives that matter. What about the archives in England? And I mean, it's going to include things like some of the British governors who maybe later wrote their autobiography. Some of the participants on the British side, it's probably not going to be from the king himself that you get a sense of what the king would say. Some noble lords and ladies, some aristocrats who were close to the Star Chamber, close to the highest levels of British government, maybe in their letters, maybe in their autobiographies, there's something written down letting you know what the king's reasoning was, right? And some of those people might be critical of it, and some of them might be making excuses for it and rationalizing it, right? This is remarkably absent from all these sources. And I have more to say. What about the French perspective? What about the Spanish perspective? What even about the Portuguese perspective? Now, I'm influenced here a little bit by my research on the history of Asia. But I'll tell you something. In any given century, if you want to know what's happening in India, very often the best source you have is Sri Lanka. There are people in Sri Lanka writing about what's happening in India with a detached perspective, right? And if you want to know what's happening in Sri Lanka, I mean, the amount of textual evidence is not, it's not as much as you have for Europe in the same period. What's happening in Sri Lanka is revealed by written records in Myanmar, by written records in Thailand and Cambodia and so on, right? Like you get incontrovertible evidence about what's really going on in these places politically from a rival empire or a rival kingdom that is keeping an eye on it. So my point is, even the Portuguese colonial archives, I mean, Portugal is not there on the spot fighting to conquer New York. They're not involved to that extent. But you better believe the Portuguese had people at every single harbor. There were entrepôts of trade, right? Portugal is trying to hold on to Brazil and its own very strange map of the world. They've got boats going everywhere. And Portugal is asking themselves the same tough questions. I mean, again, Spain is really involved. Why Portugal isn't? Well, and Portugal has to keep its eye on Spain, right? Now, again, my point is not to say like the Spanish perspective is going to be correct, whereas the American perspective is incorrect, but you're actually going to get important evidence of what happened and why from the Spanish perspective, from the French perspective, even from the Portuguese perspective, and yes, from within England itself. And this has been neglected to a tremendous extent. Now, I will say further, I don't know if there are any written records you can go to now for the indigenous people's perspective. If you guys don't know this about me, I had in my hands every single book ever published in Cree or Ojibwe. I believe at that time I have touched every book that's published in those languages, going all the way back to the Christian colonial period. Now, if you think about the geography of my life, that's not that surprising that within Canada, I was able to go to university library collections, each of which had basically tried to collect every book ever published in those languages. And there are oral traditions, there are memories of what happened in those wars that get written down. There may be nothing, there may be nothing to work from, but it certainly would be worth checking. It would certainly be interesting to know if there is. I mean, again, whether it's the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Iroquois, or down south, totally different ethnic groups and languages of indigenous people. Now, is there an indigenous perspective that is knowable, that's recorded anywhere or can be recalled anywhere? That would also, I mean, ideally, we'd get that perspective. And again, I'm not saying this to insult these guys. And again, they only have so many pages to write about the history. To what extent is the perspective of the slaves knowable? Now, this is what I have to say about that. I think the easiest way to get the perspective of the liberated slaves will be the black men who fought in the United States of America and who subsequently escaped either to Canada or to the British Isles or what have you. That was common, that there were blacks who fought against the revolution, who fought in the counter-revolutionary war, and one way or another ended up being resettled. Sometimes just back in England proper. They were evacuated to England, but sometimes to some other British colony when the war ended. And as you know, England basically lost, or England quit fighting, or what have you. So some of those people, they may have had their perspective written down. And just to give you a sense of who these guys were, so Benjamin Rush was also involved with this sort of thing when he was in England before he came over to North America. But Johnson, so is it Samuel Johnson, the author of the dictionary? I'm just getting his first name wrong. Yeah, Samuel Johnson. You know, Samuel Johnson, mostly famous for writing a dictionary of the English language. He was really involved with the trials in England that were testing and contesting the legality of slavery. He was really interested in the morality and legality of slavery. He was an anti-slavery activist. And he met and talked to Black people who were in England at that time and who often were former slaves, or they had somehow been produced by the gray area between slave and servant. You know, like, well, they weren't exactly a slave, but they were a servant to someone. And then they ended up in England and so on. So again, the Black perspective, it may be written down nowhere, but it may be written down by Blacks who subsequently spoke to white British authors about their experience, including a guy like Samuel Johnson, because there were white British people who were really interested in that, who were interested in the abolition of slavery, and they would have been interested in Black people who, from the British perspective, were returning heroes. You know, they had been heroically fighting for the king against the revolution, and now one way or another were resettled elsewhere. So this is my criticism. The first criticism is, I think that the significance of the Quebec Act has been massively underappreciated for a variety of reasons, including a strange sense of political correctness in dealing with Catholicism itself, and not taking seriously that what's going on is, yes, it's partly a war against the slaves. It's partly a war against the indigenous people. It's also a war against Catholics. It is absolutely, I mean, in large part, for Americans at this time, this is them defending this sphere of Protestant post-English Revolution religious pluralism, you know, freedom and liberty, as they talk about. These are the terms they use. They talk about freedom of conscience, liberty, that there is this realm of liberty that was created partly by the English Civil War, by Cromwell, et cetera, England's unique history of Protestantism. And again, the existence of Puritans, the existence of Quakers, so on and so forth, that's all part and parcel of that peculiar social system. So they are fighting for the defense of that more secular sphere, but also it's obviously a more Protestant sphere, against the aggrandizement, the massive expansion of Catholic power on the North American continent. So the change to the map, expanding Quebec, and making Quebec into a dictatorship where there's no democracy at all, there's no parliament, et cetera, and basically we're giving up this whole English legal tradition to hand over to the rule of one government and the power of the Catholic Church to collect tithes and so on and so forth. That is something they're fighting against, and they're already galvanized by that. They're already fighting against that before the discourse about the race war takes over. It's completely understandable that neither the authors that I'm mentioning here, Woody Holton and this particular book, 13 Clocks, it's completely understandable that they don't deal with it or that they just barely mention it. But this is a shaping and influencing factor for the American Revolution, the writing of the Constitution, to an extent that, in my opinion, I think nobody has really reckoned with yet. You can think of the American Revolution as a war against the King of England. You can, I mean, it's completely paradoxical to think of it as a war against the English, because the people fighting it consider themselves English too. Well, but in that sense, you can think of it as an English Civil War. You can think of it as a war against the Indians, a war against the indigenous people. You can think of it as a war against the slaves. But to a significant extent, it is a war against Quebec, and it is a war against Catholicism. And in the primary source documents in English, they very often use Canadian when they mean Canadien. they often say Canadian, where what they mean is French-speaking Catholic Canadians, that those are the enemy. And it is very interesting that already in like 1775, the primary sources think of themselves as American in contrast to Canadian, that the primary sources are complaining. And again, Canadian here, I think, really means Francophone Canadian. It means Catholic Francophone Canadian, that they think of themselves as Englishmen fighting against the Canadians and their Indians, i.e. the Canadians and the allied tribal people who are fighting with them, whether you think of that as mercenaries or what have you, which, by the way, is very much a military and strategic reality. It's very much just literally true that the pro-royalist forces, that the king's men, that they raised up an army of Indigenous people in the area that is now called Canada, and they marched south to fight against the American Revolution. Now, the history of how and why that happened is very interesting. This would be a much longer video if we think into that. And, what it was the Indigenous people were fighting for, what it was they thought they were fighting for, and how it was they thought they would be rewarded when the war was over. I think that is much more complex than what the interests of the Black slaves were at this time. Okay. So this is the context. Now, guys, if you want to make an intelligent comment or ask an intelligent question, now is the time. This is the context that produced the historically unique resolution set in stone in the Constitution. They didn't actually chisel it in stone. These are the historical circumstances that produced the unique resolution that every gentleman should own and carry a gun, that gentlemen should be armed, right? Now, it is really worthwhile to stop and reflect when they thought that every man should have a gun, having come out of this violent history. What did they think about women having guns? What did they think about Black people having guns? What did they think about First Nations people, American Indians, having guns? Now, many people would just insert a kind of cynical, racist or anti-racist commentary here. The reality at that time, from their perspective, was, what do you mean? All the Indigenous people have guns. That we've just been at war with them. Like, it wasn't a question of arming or disarming the Indigenous people. They were very much in a state of ongoing genocidal race war against the Indigenous people that had become more intense during the American Revolutionary period, when, for the first time, the Indigenous people were armed by the King of England to fight against them. Like this, yes, there had been race war before, but it's not that it had, put it this way, the period of the American Revolution and writing the Constitution was not a period of optimism about having a pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. It was a period when that genocidal race war had only been increased in intensity and deepened in its significance, right? When the sense of us versus them. So nobody, this is the sense in which nobody was questioning, what do you mean whether or not the Native people should have the right to have guns? They all have guns. They were just given guns by the King of England. Again, at least in terms of the mythos of the time, this was the belief. There was no question of that. And indeed, part of the justification for why all of the white people should be heavily armed all the time was this perpetual fear, a fear that would soon enough disappear, but they didn't know that. I say this is really the final period when the Indigenous people are really a major military concern. Then we go into a long period where it's totally asymmetrical and hopeless, where it's just the white people massacring and displacing them and driving them to extinction again and again. But up to and including this period, many of these battles, it seems that the odds are pretty even for the two sides. And sometimes the Native people win, sometimes the white people win. And sometimes the white people only win because of the Native people who are their allies, who are their mercenaries, who are fighting for them, that a lot of the battles are decided in this way. That was their experience of war. So these are the historical circumstances that produced a unique experiment in the history of the world. Now, okay, we could insert here a long digression on what the European attitude towards guns was. But I am going to assert as my thesis. In Europe, they had a very simple idea of aristocracy. Okay? An aristocrat was a man who carried a sword. An aristocrat was a man who had military training, who was willing at any time to stop everything he was doing and devote all of his time, attention, energy, and money to fighting on behalf of the king. It's part of the definition of being an aristocrat in the Dark Ages. Right? The aristocrats were not on vacation. They again, for most of history, there isn't really a sense of a professional army. There isn't a sense of being a soldier as something separate from the career of being a civilian, right? Like aristocrats were people who spent their time breeding and training horses during peacetime. They were men who would wear a sword at all times and ride a horse and carry a sword, that they would maintain military training and so on and so forth. And even though they might be wealthy, whenever there was a war, they were expected to just take all their horses and give them to the king's army. And often they were reluctant. That's part of the reason why they would dispute, do we really have to fight this war, so on and so forth. That was the model of military organization that emerged from the Dark Ages in Europe. Right now, if you go back to Rome and Athens, it's a very different organization of what is an army, and indeed what is an aristocrat. Right now, coeval with these assumptions, right, is the importance of the duel, the importance of honor. So an aristocrat is someone who carries a sword and who is willing to kill anyone at any time with no legal repercussions to fight a duel over a point of honor. Now, as you may know, this cultural tradition made the transition from swords to guns with no substantive changes, right? Now, it's horrifying in many different ways. European society did not have any concept of the police in this period, of a professional police force. As I say, there's a limited extent to which the idea of a professional soldier, career soldier, I can't say it doesn't exist at all, but this is much more the realm of amateurs. It's much more, the realm of being a gentleman, being an aristocrat, and devoting your life to military affairs and so on and so forth. But wars come and go. There are periods of time when every able-bodied man is pushed into the army. There are periods of time when this is not the case. But the career soldier, their conception of this is somewhat different from ours. An aristocrat was in part a career farmer, but also someone who was living in preparation for. So the idea of law and order, the idea of social order, right? For centuries in Europe, this revolved around the notion of men with swords, and this transforms into men with guns carried on their person, who are willing at any time to stand up, take off their glove, and throw it to the ground and say, "Sir, you dishonor me," and fight to the death. All right. Now, most of you have probably only seen this in comedy. Well, it was deadly serious, and it was still deadly serious in the United States at this time. And in countries where there was more upward mobility, where anyone could kind of claim to be an aristocrat, where someone could get some money and backing on them and start living like an aristocrat, there were more people participating in the culture of the duel, right? Now, in this period, and indeed even after the American Revolution, you can go through the court records. Dueling was simply legal murder. It was simply completely accepted that human beings would settle their disputes amongst each other this way, by fighting to the death. And, again, there isn't this sense that police officers have the exclusive right to use armed force, that only police officers should carry and use guns, and that a police officer is a professional who has a certain kind of education, a certain kind of career. All of that is absent, right? This is the notion that men of honor carry swords, carry guns, and they will stand up and fight because, for example, another man said that your sister is a whore. Right? So the idea of law enforcement is much more all-pervasive, right? And the idea that you're living a life of honor all the time. This is the cultural framework out of which, American gun ideology emerged. Now, again, aristocrats, one reason to carry a sword or carry a gun might be the possibility that you will be robbed by your own peasants. You will be robbed by your own household servants, even in the absence of outright slavery. When we get into slave-owning aristocrats, you can imagine one reason to carry a gun, carry a sword, the same reason that you carry a whip, and the same reason why the slaves are wearing chains was so that physically you had an advantage over people who might want to rob you, might want to kill you. who surrounded you, who you worked with closely. Day after day, this wasn't a remote social problem. This was the context out of which the American Constitution emerged. You will look in vain for a single word about policing, about the relationship of police to the public in the American Constitution. That concept really did not exist yet. The concept was some people have guns and some people don't. Some people have honor and some people don't. And that was how society was supposed to govern itself, with a tremendously high rate of constant internecine violence. Now, sorry, this is to be a bit edgy. Okay, so I mean, actually from a 21st century perspective, you could call this anarchy. This kind of anarchist society, armed anarchists. Okay, so the front page of the New York Times today, the number quoted is that 1,500 have died in these types of shootings between the year 2009 and 2022. Okay. Before dueling was made illegal, and it's a very different timeline in England, in France, in the United States of America, like whichever Western society you want to look at, how many men lost their lives in duels year after year, and the whole population of the planet was lower? Like, what percentage of the best and brightest in society were being killed by duels year after year after year? Yes, sometimes it could be for a good reason, but as you know, and this is why there's so much comedy about it, it could indeed be for a very petty reason indeed. There was a body count. There was a price to men being able to carry guns from the first invention of the gun, right? But again, in terms of the emergence of police, so I'm sorry, this is a profound and important topic. In England, I will say this, and sorry, by the way, have you ever heard of police officers in ancient Athens? Huh? What does Aristotle say about police officers, about education training for police? How about police officers in ancient Rome? My thesis would be that in England, the first emergence of something like a police officer was the turnstile. So we still have this word, turnstile in English. Sorry, I misspoke. Turnpike. Sorry, I misspoke. You can see I got them mixed up. The idea of a turnpike by a highway. So turnpike, it's an etymologically very clear word in our language. There was a time when all roads in England were privately owned. So quite likely some aristocrat built a road and would charge you money to travel on a road when the state of urban planning and transportation was really poor. And there would be a kind of soldier. And again, this is not really a soldier. It's not really an army. But there was an armed man with a pike who would have to stand guard at the entrance to the road constantly, right? People could only use this road who paid a certain amount of money or who maybe had a contract, an agreement with whoever it was who owned the road. Like you could imagine, there might be businesses, regular users, and they worked out a contract, said, look, we're going to pay you $100 now, so you don't have to pay 10 cents every time we use it. But there were these complex arrangements, and you had to have men with arms. It was a pike, traditionally, who would stand guard at the entrance to the road. And it is indescribable what misery it was to live in the dark ages in England when there were no public roads, when all roads were private, when it was a privilege you had to pay for to use a road. So this is, to my mind, the creation of armed men standing on guard at all times. In my book, No More Manifestos, a lot of the evidence of how society works is implicit in primary source and history. In my book, No More Manifestos, I mention an attempted assassination of one of the prime ministers of England. And, the assassin succeeds, I should say. So it was the assassination of one of the prime ministers of England. And what happens? There are no police. People set hands upon him, and he is dragged off to the inns of justice. The reality of, when you're reading this implicitly, at this time, what was a police officer? What was a court? What was a jury indeed? What was a trial? What was a lawyer? How did this work in any given century? It's very easy to read ancient, medieval, or even Renaissance, or whatever you want to say, to read sources from earlier centuries and to impose onto them our assumptions about how policing works, or how men carrying arms, just armed people, standing guard or whatever, created or sustained justice, law, and order. It's very, very easy to assume these things. And in so doing, we are massively diminishing the significance of aristocrats in society. The fact that actually, even including marital disputes, that people would actually go to an aristocrat and say, "My lord," they would ask for intercession, they would ask for justice, they would ask for this from aristocrats. That aristocrats did sit on a kind of throne, even if it was just for their own little village. That there was a, doing justice and resolving disputes and so on. That very often this wasn't a professional criminal justice system, that instead these ideas emerged out of an aristocratic system of in the Dark Ages. Okay, I'm just going to pause to read some of these. If Melissa, if you want to comment, Oliver says, "quote The ephebia was an ancient Greek institution which Aristotle describes in Athenian politics." So I assume you mean the politeia of the Athenians, whatever, the Constitution of Athens, in which all male youth had military training for a couple of years and were guards in Athens. Right. So Oliver, I've talked about that a lot. I think both in writing and in YouTube videos. That was the system of education that they had, and the system of required military service. However, after they had completed that education, right, they are just citizens. Right. So that's the emphasis I put on it, that this is the origin of government education in the Athenian imagination. And a lot of what's going on in political philosophy at that time is people, including Plato, their imaginations running wild about how we could improve society by reforming and improving the system of education, because they saw what a dramatic effect that system of education had, just in contrasting Athens to other cities within Greece, that this was the making of an Athenian and a citizen and a participant in democracy. However, people were not divided whereby some are police and some are citizens, whereby some are lawyers, some are bureaucrats, et cetera, and some are ordinary citizens. That distinction didn't exist. Instead, it is actually very difficult for people now to imagine the implications of the type of equality that existed amongst citizens in Athens. Anyone could do justice at the peril of their own life. Anyone could stand up and speak in their Senate, the Pnyx, it's not called the Senate. Anyone could stand up and speak and debate what should happen in an ongoing war, for example, or what should happen with sewage treatment. They did have to worry about that. These kinds of things, these kinds of local questions. Anyone could, at the peril of their life. So the distinction we have between senator and citizen didn't exist, between policeman and citizen didn't exist, between lawyer and citizen didn't exist. So there is a radical, important kind of equality there, even if, of course, we recognize it was a slave society. There was an unequal society in numerous other ways, including, obviously, economic inequality. Nevertheless, this is really important to recognize. So, babe, do you want to, if anyone has anything tremendously intelligent to say, from my perspective, this video is soon going to come to an end as I basically bring back these conclusions to the question of legislation of guns and what is possible next in 21st century American society. Yeah. So let's just say that's also an interesting question. Oliver says, quote, when reading Aristotle's Politics, I was looking for his view on leaders of slave rebellions. That's what I was looking for in Aristotle when I was your age, I think a couple years younger than you are now. But when I was first reading Aristotle, slavery was the number one issue I wanted to see his perspective on. Anyway, I continue quoting Oliver, quote, whether they count as free people on the wrong side since he is pro-slavery, close quote. Yeah, Aristotle has an anguished position on slavery, I would say. He is aware of the self-contradiction he is led into by it. But his conclusion is that some people by nature should be slaves and some people by nature should be free. And he thinks it is a great crime or a great shame. It's very immoral for someone who ought to be free to instead be a slave. But he doesn't see anything wrong with people who are by nature slavish to be slaves. That is the conclusion he comes to, and this is wildly inconsistent with what he says about political equality throughout the rest of his work, and his own life experience as someone who owned slaves and worked with slaves himself, and so on. Doubtless comes into this, but yeah, Aristotle ultimately cannot take the final step that his own political philosophy obliges him to take. Oliver has certainly heard me say this before. It's inevitable and inexorable that Aristotle rejects the leadership of Alexander the Great, which is tremendously dangerous for him, that he rejects a basically monarchical or dictatorial system of government, and that he instead preaches for his own kind of moderate democracy, using modern terms here. He rejects the extreme democracy of Athens, but he wants a kind of moderate democracy. Now, I can get into it's a different video or something exactly what that means. But his version of moderate democracy, some of the cities that are walking distance from Athens had it. So there was a model of democracy that already existed in the real world and that was known within Greece, but it wasn't what Athens had specifically. That was his position on democracy. So yeah, Aristotle really was bold enough and was gutsy enough to reject what was at that time the ascendant political model, the rule of Alexander the Great. And his own family was directly connected to Alexander the Great. And he personally was connected to Alexander the Great. So he did the right thing at the risk of his own life there, but he wasn't able to take the step and really recognize the type of political equality that must unite slaves with the rest of humanity. That this is absurd and ridiculous. So I'd say it this way: he's bold enough to say it's ridiculous to raise up Alexander to be something superhuman, to treat a king or a dictator or any great leader, to treat a king or leader as if his or her political rights are better than the rest of humanity. But what he's not willing to do is to recognize that it's equally absurd to treat the slaves as subhuman, or as if free people are superhuman relative to the slaves, and to have two different sets of political rights that way. And I think his explanation himself is very human and pathetic, frankly. He doesn't have anything intellectually sophisticated to say or philosophically profound to say on that. And, with the exception of Benjamin Rush, you will be very disappointed by what the founding fathers of the United States of America have to say about this. The continuum of stupidity and the shallowness of the excuses, going from Aristotle in ancient Athens to Thomas Jefferson, in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, it's truly pathetic. So when I was a young man, I really couldn't stand reading Aristotle for that reason. It was just infuriating to me. But I got older and I gained the detachment to appreciate what Aristotle is doing right while being aware of what he's doing wrong. And in a sense, that's what we're doing in this whole conversation in relation to the American Revolution. We're willing to reflect on what they did right in relation to what they did wrong. So just come back to something. Again, I'm happy to see your comments or questions. And by the way, guys, hit the thumbs up button if you have a chance now. If your hands are not dripping wet from washing the dishes, okay, put the dishes down, towel your, and then hit the thumbs up button. We should have as many thumbs up as we have people, or more. I said earlier that the United States, these unique political conditions that include race war, racialized slavery, and that race war against the indigenous people, that this produced the unique experiment in human history of having every able-bodied man carry a gun. And I contrasted this to the aristocratic history of Europe and the assumptions about swords and the assumptions about guns that were built into that produced a very strange patchwork of societies in Europe within the same century, let's say, as the American Revolution. It wasn't the case that there was one principle in Europe about gun ownership in this time. It's a mess, and there's a lot of violence. There are a lot of people dying every year in duels and in petty squabbles. And very stereotypically in this period, you can even read Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. People would kill each other because their sister lost their virginity with someone from your household, and this kind of thing. I mean, and those are the things that led to not just a duel between two men, but again, as Romeo and Juliet depicts, gangs of armed men representing one household fighting against gangs of armed men from another household. There are very, very high levels of violence this way, and there are no police to report to. In as much as there are courts, it is a court in the medieval aristocrat. Think about the meaning of the word court. It's a court where the judge is, quote unquote, my lord, ruling over a court of courtiers, the courtiers of the court, and so on. I'm sorry, but the king's court. This has a certain meaning in English that we forget when we're talking about a court of law. I'll just point out, though, the history of China, tremendously violent. At no point did the history of China produce the conclusion Americans came to, again, circa 1776, circa 1789, whatever you want to put the conclusion. The history of China did not produce the conclusion that every man should be a gentleman, every man should be an aristocrat, every man should carry a sword and a gun all the time. The history of India never produced this conclusion. These are societies with many millions of people and now over 1 billion people each. These are not trivial footnotes in the history of the world. Now, again, frankly, you can include very small societies. You can include Cambodia, you can include Laos, we can get into Polynesian islands and so on. But how violence is supposed to be controlled, who has a monopoly on munitions, on armaments, on the use of force, right? There's a sense in which every society in every century of the history of the world has had to ask and answer these questions, whether implicitly or explicitly, right? Who gets to carry guns? Who gets to carry swords, depending on the historical period? And Japan, you may not know this, but it's very much represented in their fiction. There was a period in Japan where the emperor forbid anyone to have metal swords, and where men still fought each other using wooden swords, but where all the swords were basically taken in and kept in warehouses. Like, obviously the army could still use swords in time of war, but this was really a shocking kind of gun control of its era. There have been different societies at different times that did have the centralization and exclusive control of who gets to use a steel sword and who doesn't, who gets to use explosive guns, so on and so forth, and who doesn't. So it's a question everyone has had to ask and everyone has had to answer. Now, I've opened this video by saying I don't believe in progress. And on the contrary, I think it's tremendously important to attack and overturn the notion of progress that shapes how we think about law, how we think about democracy, how we think about politics. At one time, the people of France decided to completely legalize prostitution. All right? At another time, they decided that was a mistake, and they would totally criminalize prostitution. They would try to get rid of it. They would try to limit and diminish it. Now, I believe Germany is currently in a transitional period this way. It's a little bit different from one province to the next in Germany, but Germany embraced the idea that sex work is just work. I mean, again, the Netherlands, another very dramatic history this way. And then you get to see the consequences of legalizing prostitution. Okay, the history of Thailand, the history of Taiwan, the history of South Korea. At one time, people make one decision, and then they make another, and they write it down on a piece of paper, no different from a napkin. We are ruled by these conceptions or misconceptions for a time, and then simply we change our minds, and we have to be willing to rip up that piece of paper and start again. If you think the Constitution can't change, if you think the Constitution is a scientific discovery, like Sir Isaac Newton discovering gravity, I'm not going to digress into a critique of that notion, but obviously a simplification of the history of science say that, or the discovery that the Earth is a sphere rather than flat or something, which is a very complex history too, or Copernicus, whatever discovery. All right, it's not the case that there was some scientific discovery when the American Constitution was written. The American Constitution represents a very strange set of compromises, short-term compromises, short-term solutions to short-term crises. That's something that Woody Holton's approach is really strong on, giving you a sense of what the short-term crises were they were responding to. And unquestioned, deep-seated cultural assumptions, bigotry, and prejudice that go back for centuries. This was put together in one document at one time. People can decide that they should write an amendment to the Constitution to make alcohol illegal. And they did. The people of America made alcohol illegal. And then they got to see the consequences of that. And they changed their minds, and they wrote another amendment to the Constitution that ended the period of prohibition, that ended the period in which alcohol was. This is a huge fundamental change in society. So what is progress? Does progress mean that there is a single arrow pointing in a single direction, whereby in the medieval past, people thought sobriety was important. People thought being abstemious and refusing drugs and alcohol was more. And then we have emerged out of the Dark Ages into an era of increasing enlightenment, where our increasingly liberal modern scientific attitudes instead embrace everyone getting drunk all the time, everyone smoking marijuana all the time, everyone using recreational drugs, whether it be cocaine, heroin. That is it the fact there is a single direction to progress, right? Whereby we go from prohibitionism to embracing the profligate, decriminalized use of drugs. A lot of people want you to believe that. And a lot of people implicitly, without challenging it, that's what they believe or assume. They don't want to think, hey, you know what? We've just tried different strategies. There have just been revisions. There's just been aimless, staggering, ignorant decisions made at different times by different people. And maybe in the Dark Ages, they were right about some things, and maybe we're wrong about them right now. And my classic example of this, many people do think of this in terms of progress in one direction, is inbreeding, cousin marriage. The Catholic Church in the Dark Ages really forbid people from marrying their own cousins, from having children with their own cousins. Guess what? The Catholic Church was right. A whole lot of people still to this day, I've made separate YouTube videos talking about it, and I've seen clips of people saying this on the news. A whole lot of people will prevent you with it. Pardon me. A whole lot of people will present you with the story that we had a bigoted, ignorant attitude towards marrying your cousin in the past. And then the progress of science and enlightenment has led us to this more liberal society today, where we reject that, and that progress is getting rid of these misconceptions from the Dark Ages. No, it's not. Okay? No, it's not. Guess what? The Catholic Church wasn't wrong about everything. Okay? Guess what? The Catholic Church was right about inbreeding. They were right about making it illegal to marry your cousin, to have children with your cousin. Can't be wrong about everything. And indeed, there are many countries in the world where up to a certain date, marrying your cousin was illegal, and then they liberalized it. They removed that law. They made it legal to marry your own cousin, where they need to take a step back again. They need to revert to what the law was before. And I mean, there is a sense in which everything I have to say about democracy is saying we should go back to something they got right in ancient Athens. Not everything. There were a lot of things they were wrong about in ancient Athens, but saying, hey, the same way the Catholic Church just happened to be right about this one thing, they happened to be correct about inbreeding and cousin marriage. In Athens, there are some things they were right about, and we still need to learn that lesson, in a sense, revert to them. We're not talking about progress. We're talking about regress, we're talking about regressing to stuff that was right before. There is neither progress nor regress. They're just human beings that get that come up with different strategies to solve different social problems at different points in time. You still want to jump in, babe?
At what point is this a social problem that demands
Right.
ultimately?
Okay, so Melissa's asked me a question that's reasonably profound. I'm glad, guys. By all means, if you have something intelligent to say it. If you have an intelligent question to ask it. But Melissa gets to preempt your questions with her. Okay. Melissa has asked, at what point does something become a problem that democracy must address, or that the government must address? You can put it that way, right? So, the headline again here is 1,500 dead bodies from 2009 to 2022. All right. I think that the tremendous power of journalists during the 20th century lulled people into a presupposition that there's some kind of objectively real threshold whereby a problem becomes so pressing, becomes so overwhelming that the government must address it, and that it does. Take off a layer here. It was cold this morning when we got started. It was very easy for Americans to imagine that there was just some kind of objectively real tipping point at which massacres carried out in Vietnam were so bad, were so problematic, that the whole Vietnam War became immoral and had to be opposed. This is one example. It was very easy because of the power of the press to imagine that the status of Black people had gotten worse and worse, and that the violence of repressing civil rights protesters had gotten worse and worse. And then objectively, the government had to do something, had to address it. And in every period, this is false. The period you're complaining about, sorry, the you being hypothetical, the period of the civil rights activists, Blacks in America had better conditions than they'd ever had before. If anything, it's the opposite. It's that their conditions had gotten better, not worse. And, again, I'm not belittling it. The sense that there was a short-term crisis that needed to be addressed, this is totally a creation of the press. Now, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, that is what I'm alluding to in saying this about the American war in Vietnam, and the distortion of all American political discourse about what the hell they were doing in Vietnam anyway. What was there to be won, what was to be lost, what was American foreign policy in Asia and in anti-communism and around the world, right? It's totally, it's created by the press. Obviously, by the way, I'm not saying the My Lai massacre didn't happen. The My Lai massacre did happen, but this was turned into a kind of crisis that needed to be addressed. And likewise, at the beginning of the Vietnam War, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is very much created by and for the press. The idea that suddenly there was a crisis in Vietnam that America had to intervene to address, which is also, again, it's untrue in many different levels, what happened with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The reality is that from the day the French removed their military intelligence service, the American military, American intelligence took over the same offices. The American army, American government, however you want to put it, took over the administration of Vietnam as a colony, absolutely on the same day the French left. That America was in a kind of pseudo-colonial position in Vietnam long before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, long before the beginning of the Vietnam War. Anyway, this has to do with the unique circumstances of the French humiliation in both Vietnam and Laos at that time and what happened. And by the way, it has everything to do with opium also, and the French military being involved in it was French intelligence, but anyway, French military intelligence being involved in selling and transporting opium to make money to support the French empire over there. So I've just mentioned a whole bunch of things that 99.9% of people don't know. And frankly, none of this is secret, but most Americans have no idea that the origins of the Vietnam War have a lot to do with the French Empire's involvement in dope smuggling, whatever you want to say, opium innovation. Well, it does. And, America's position in Vietnam emerged out of this, as well as, by the way, America's situation in Vietnam had a lot to do with very sincere anti-communism. Wanting to make the world safe for democracy in that period was no joke. And America was in a very difficult, self-contradictory position on that. So anyway, America getting more and more deeply committed to military action and an expanding scope of military action in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos that then unfolds gradually, I would say, but certainly long before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. My point is to say this: the power of newspapers in the 20th century was such that they seemed to present the public with these very clear, objectively real tipping points and turning points in history. Now the Gulf of Tonkin incident has happened. Now the My Lai massacre has happened. And by the way, just before the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were several black sanitation workers, black guys employed in handling garbage men, in effect, who were killed in Memphis, and that's actually why Martin Luther King went to Memphis at that time. So I just say there were actually a couple of killings just before Martin Luther King was killed. It was very easy to take these killings and to take, specific photographs of police using hoses to hose down protesters and so on, and to present this as some kind of sudden turning point in the history of civil rights. So I think this is an illusion that the newspapers have created, and it's an illusion that politicians have to some extent willingly participated in. And I'm saying the 20th century repeatedly. I don't even think the 19th century was like that. Like, I think you could get specific about when exactly does this begin and when exactly does it end. But this kind of power the press had in shaping, political discourse. Now, I'm a nihilist. I don't believe in any of these ideals. How is this more important? So 1,500 people die in more than 10 years. How is that more important than the future of Afghanistan? Nobody in America cares about democracy in Afghanistan anymore. Nobody cares about human rights or women's rights in Afghanistan. What can I tell you? Democracy is like a faucet. It turns off and on. Sometimes it's running hot. Sometimes it's off and gone. How is this more important than circumcision? And we could say male circumcision or female circumcision. I like to say both because I think morally they are tantamount. Sorry, how many million boys are losing 60% of the nerve endings in their penis every year? What percentage of American men have this? And again, yeah. What percentage have even worse side effects as a result? What percentage of women globally, or what percentage of women in Afghanistan are permanently physically sexually disabled? We were even watching a documentary about that in Africa, Muslim Africa, and women who are disabled forever. That's a crisis. That's neither more nor less of a crisis than what happens to appear on the front page of the newspaper. And sorry, look, obviously I could go on and on with many examples, but if you just look at the list of Bernie Sanders electoral issues, I'm sorry, what percentage of people are bankrupted for life by the university education system in America? What percentage of people are bankrupted for life because of health insurance costs, prescription drug costs? These are not minor problems in America. These are unbelievably major problems that leave America in its shadow. The crisis in education, however you want to put it, these questions. And there is no rock bottom. It's not the case that you're going to reach some objectively real tipping point. And again, I'm sorry to say this, but the My Lai massacre was not an objectively real tipping point. Compare the My Lai massacre to massacres the Americans did in South Korea in the Korean War, or whatever you want to say. War involves massacres. I'm not pro massacre. I'm not justifying the My Lai massacre. But like the idea that there's some unique turning point like this, well, that is an illusion created by the press. By the way, there were atrocities committed during World War II on all sides. The British committed atrocities. The Americans committed. Sorry, how does the My Lai massacre compare to what the British Empire had been doing in Malaysia, formerly known as Malaya, right then? What the British Empire was doing in North Africa, what the British Empire even did in Cyprus, and this is the post-World War II period. I'm not talking about ancient history of these examples. There were a lot of massacres in the dying days of the British Empire at the end of World War II and those years right after that. Let alone getting into British India and so on and so forth. There were a lot of massacres to go around, but this creation of the sense of a crisis and that it's now the government has to act, and it's now that the public has to rise up. I think that's really a 20th century phenomenon. So what are you gonna say about? Yeah.
I hate to make it about people.
Right. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So this is I've introduced this without explaining it very well, but every so often, climate change is on the front page of the newspaper. Every so often, overpopulation globally in relation to ecology is on the front page of the newspaper. Well, the problem isn't really the number of bipeds. The problem is the total number of mammals. That, yes, the world is overpopulated, but we have billions of cows, billions of pigs, billions of sheep, at least tens of millions of dogs, that it's the biomass of the mammals in total, not necessarily humans, that's the problem. So if you change the ratio of humans to cows and humans to pigs by having those humans convert to veganism, to a shocking extent, that's the problem solved. It solves global warming, solves ecology, solves overpopulation, so on and so forth. So two things. One, the point is that this is something like circumcision. This is something like democracy in Afghanistan or what have you. It's simply not in the newspapers. It's simply not thought of as a major crisis to be solved at this moment, that we're at a crossroads where it must be addressed now. But the other point is, as I say, there is no rock bottom. There is no point at which you say, oh, well, animal agriculture is so bad. The ecological consequences of our diet are so bad that now we have to legislate. Now we have to turn things around. Now we have to change. There is no point at which gun violence is so bad that it hits rock bottom. And it's never going to happen. There is no rock bottom. Sorry, but what's rock bottom for democracy in Hong Kong? What's rock bottom for democracy in Myanmar? There is no rock bottom, guys. Things can get worse and worse and keep getting worse. Under communism, you might think, oh, well, once people start starving to death, then they're going to question this and start asking new questions about economics and coming to new conclusions about economics and politics and democracy. Nope. Like 1 million people can die, and 5 million people can die, and 10 million people can die, and there's still no rock bottom, right? We could say this about freedom of speech and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a comforting thought to imagine that there's a kind of biological equilibrium to politics, whereby a problem reaches a certain threshold point at which it must be addressed. And again, whether you're thinking of ecology, communism, or what have you, no. And the 20th century certainly was a unique century. Yeah. I'll put it this way. Sorry.
I will just use as an example that you've used before, Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Yes.
Whether it was how it was explained to me when I was young, it did seem to me that there was just this point where there were so many incidents of drunk drivers killing people that at some point they enacted these gun laws. Right. But is that really the truth behind what happened?
Yeah. Another example of that is the concept of having a minimum age of consent for sexuality, the concept of statutory rape being invented. And again, the reality is it's like a speed limit. I mean, human beings, right. But that's right. There's no point at which so many people are dying in traffic accidents that you lower the speed limit. Human beings just have a meeting. And I would prefer if we had democracy, I would prefer if all of us voted in a referendum, say, look, from now on, 80 miles per hour is the speed limit. Like, whatever, the maximum speed limit is 80 miles per hour. We can't have people going 120 miles per hour anymore, whatever it is. No, I mean, it is just something written down on a piece of paper. And as you know, I mean, the definition of statutory rape, the age of consent, in one place it can be 18, in another place it can be 16. In some places it's 14, and so on. There's no simple biological reality. There's no scientific discovery. In the truest sense of the word convention, this is what it is. We convene and we make a decision as human beings. Okay, this is the number we're going to write down, whether that's a speed limit or an age of consent. This is what we're going to live by. And if we were wrong, we might have to go back and revise the decision we've made. We might have to try again with a different assumption. That is indeed why constitutions can never be set in stone. And they aren't. I mean, in reality, they're not. Anyway, it's a good digression. I mean, it's a digression from a digression. Okay, here are some other interesting comments here. Anyway, guys, if you have something intelligent to say it. I am going to go back and reread this stuff. So about gun control, about legislation of gun control and limiting gun violence. All of the technology that fits into this cellular phone. I mean, I have the rubber wrapper on this. It's unbelievable how slender cell phones are now. When I was a boy, I did envision this technological transformation happening. I was following what was happening in technology. I did think that this was inevitable, but I imagined it being more like a brick. I did think we would all be carrying around with us portable computers that incorporated telephones and cameras and things, computers and word processors and email. And at that time, the fax machine, I thought, yeah, the equivalent of the fax machine is going to be miniaturized and made portable this way, so on and so forth. But I knew what circuit boards looked like. I knew circuit boards were becoming more and more powerful, but I never thought circuit boards would be so tiny as this, that I can place it between my thumb and forefinger like that. I did assume it would be bigger, even though I did. It was partly because of the science fiction I was reading. It was something I reflected on, partly just because of the science I was reading. I thought we were moving toward a society where everyone had this kind of video camera and computer with them at all times. All of the technology that fits into this tiny cell phone can be fit into the handle of a gun. All of it. It is possible for every firearm in the United States of America to take an image, take a photograph from a forward-facing camera, and to take a photograph from a backward-facing camera of the shooter and the person being shot, and to send it over the internet to the police station instantly, every single time you pull the trigger. It is possible for a gun to record your location with GPS, a global positioning system, the same way that every cell phone records your location with every text message you send. So some of you may have followed this in the news, some of you may not have. I have covered on my channel at least one case where there's evidence presented in court of exactly where the person's car was because they were text messaging while driving. And you get a map with a series of dots saying, yeah, at exactly this moment, she was driving her car at this intersection. At this moment, she was at this stoplight. At this moment, she was on the freeway, because it's someone engaged in this conversation that is on the record for the government, recording her precise location and what she was doing moment by moment with the cell phone. Okay, having all of the technology that is within a cell phone built into every firearm is attainable. It's easily attainable. There was a time when I was a boy. Imagine if someone had said to you, when I was a boy, we're talking about more than 30 years ago, oh, it'll be possible in the future to have a fingerprint detector that instantly reads your fingerprint and confirms that you're the owner of the gun. That might have sounded ridiculous or impracticable 30 years ago. Now, every single one of you is familiar with just how streamlined that process would be, just how instantly you can verify your identity. With facial recognition, right? A lot of you have phones that scan your face. With fingerprint recognition, right? So if you allow government regulation of gun ownership, we could be in a situation where when someone is mugged, they pull out their gun and point it at the mugger, and without even pulling the trigger, that gun is already taking photographs and uploading them to the internet, up and sending them to the police. The gun is already recording your exact location, the direction the gun is pointed in, who it's being pointed at, and it's even photographing. It could be recording audio too. You could have a microphone in there just as well as we have. It's recording exactly what happened to all parties, moment by moment, for the historical record. And in a sense, if you're defending yourself against a mugger, that could be a reason not to pull the trigger. Because as soon as you got the gun out, you can say, look, when this goes to court, you've already been had. Like, it's over. So, like, you should not attack me. You should put down your weapon, or you should, because look, when the cops go over this footage, they're going to know exactly what happened and who you are and your face and where we were and what happened. So just give up. Just wait for the cops to come. Don't ruin your life. Don't put yourself in jail longer, and don't get shot. Right? So it may seem paradoxical. You should have fewer shootings that way. You could have a database in the same way that today we are recording the location of every single voice message, every single text message, every single email sent from a cell phone, every single bullet that's fired in the United States of America. That's far fewer. What do you think there were more of in America today? Text messages or bullets being fired? And yeah, a lot of that things in that database, it would just be, okay, at this time in this location, someone was firing a bullet in the middle of the forest. They were killing a deer. I mean, a lot of it's going to be information that's not legally useful are interesting. But then everyone involved would know that from the minute, it doesn't even have to be when they pull the trigger. It can be when their hand is on the gun, right? It can be before, even if it's only a few moments before they pull the trigger. Their location is recorded. Their identity is recorded, right? Who it is they're pointing the gun at is recorded. And you can even have a rear-facing camera recording that you're the one holding the gun. That today is easily attainable in the United States of America. And guys, guns are expensive. I mean, do you think this would even increase the price of firearms by $40? I don't. I think this would be invisible. I think you might be talking about $20 into the price of it, because you can buy a cell phone for $40. Most of the cost is the screen. You know, obviously we're not talking about having a full color screen on your gun so you can watch movies, so you can watch YouTube videos on your gun, right? So there are a lot of features of the phone that are not going to be there. It's going to be cheaper than a phone in many ways, right? But I'm saying the other elements of cellular phone technology, cellular phone networks, and so on, those can be seamlessly, invisibly integrated into even a handgun. Of course, there's plenty of room in a shotgun, right? So we're not on the cusp of a new technology that could change gun violence. For several decades, that technology has existed. Wouldn't you like to know what happened in each and every gun battle in America's conquest of Iraq, America's conquest of Afghanistan, the Ukrainian war against Russia right now, with the same level of specificity? This could be the end of war crimes as we know it. Imagine a man who's aware of this in time of war. This is one of the most common crimes in modern warfare. Imagine a man raping a woman at gunpoint. Sorry, guys, this is real talk. We're talking about real world here. And he's aware that this is being photographed, his precise location, that it's his fingerprint on the gun. He's aware that his army commanders are going to know this, that the police are going to know this, that the people who write the history books are going to know this, that this can never be secret, that even if he kills her after the rape so she can't tell anyone else, which is also common in war, in case you didn't know, that his crime, exactly what he did, exactly what he said, can be a microphone recording his voice in the gun too, that will be recorded for posterity. How would soldiers behave differently, even with the stress of the battlefront, right? Even with the stress of being in a war zone, if they know who they shoot, what they say, and what they do is being recorded, and that if they die, their heroism will be recorded for their own parents to see, for their own children and grandchildren to see, perhaps, right? And that if they behave dishonorably, what they do in war will be there for their parents to see, for their grandchildren to see, as well as journalists, politicians, military commanders. We have reached the point where the medieval fantasy of an omniscient God can be a technological reality built into the steel housing of every handgun. And this isn't new. Most of you are too young to remember a time before this technology existed. I'm just barely old enough to remember the rise of the cellular phone. The idea of mandating it is new. Okay. Because most people in positions of power do not want cell phone cameras and cell phone recordings of what goes on inside Guantanamo Bay. When prison guards, just within the normal prisons of New York City, Rikers Island, whatever example you want, when prison guards brutalize and intimidate and beat inmates, when prison guards shoot inmates, people in positions of power are quite comfortable with the ambiguity of relying on the word of the one and only witness to the event, who most often is the man who pulled the trigger. That when police shoot people, there are people in positions of power who are very comfortable with the only version of events being the police officer's version. And I'm not comfortable with that. We are progressing toward a society in which the professor standing at the front of the university has a camera recording everything he said, whether it's built into his hat or his eyeglasses or what have you, and where every single student in the crowd has a camera of some kind recording what happens. And this will result in a higher standard of behavior, a higher standard of deontology, if you like, for the professors and for the students alike, right? When I grew up, there were these cases of he said, she said about professors sleeping with students or professors flirting with students, professors saying politically incorrect things in class, sometimes professors saying racist things in class. Okay, well, that's over. We're entering into an era when even the most trivial controversy of this kind, of a politically incorrect professor, this kind of thing, where your opinion doesn't matter because we can all consult what's on the tape, quite possibly from 40 different angles, from the perspective of 40 different students, each and every one of whom has a recording device. So what is the future of gun violence in America? Is it a future of anonymity and impunity? That's what military gun violence has presumed. That's what police gun violence has presumed. And again, there are a lot of other people with guns, like prison guards, right? Anonymity, impunity, no accountability. And the elderly people who are currently in power. I'm sorry, but politics is dominated by geriatrics. People over 80 dominate politics within the Republican Party, within the Democrat Party. It's old people. It's people Joe Biden's age and older who dominate politics in most Western democracies today. They're real comfortable with that. All right. And there's a new generation coming up that's saying, whoa, 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 whoa. When there's even a minor dispute between a taxi driver and his passenger, it's all on tape. Like we're used to this. You know, sometimes the taxi driver punched the customer, but they say, yeah, but I punched the customer for a reason. You have to see it in context. We are accustomed to seeing footage of diners at McDonald's freaking out and assaulting the staff at McDonald's. They grab a bunch of plastic spoons and throw them at the person. We know exactly what they did. We know exactly what they said. Within the halls of power, this may be different where you are, but in Taiwan, every time members of parliament punch each other, it's on camera, and they fight. They get into, fisticuffs in parliament. There are kind of little riots within their House of Parliament where they really, yeah. Some, where you live, your House of Parliament, I would assume most of the world, every little thing that's said and done inside your House of Parliament is recorded. Okay, so you think the battlefront just doesn't matter? You think what soldiers do in times of war is less important, is less significant than whether or not this taxi driver made a racist remark that justified the passenger in the taxi punching the driver, or whether or not there are two different versions where the taxi driver says the passenger refused to pay money and the passenger says, no, the taxi driver ripped me off and stole my money. All of these petty disputes, right? We don't rely on witness testimony anymore. We rely on the godlike omniscience of portable recording devices that are in every home. They're in every pocket, and they can be on your hat or glasses or pinned to your lapel. They're one of the major responses to police brutality within the last 5 years has been to demand that every police officer wear a camera at all times. And then there's a separate question, which is constitutional. Who gets to control that footage? Is that footage immediately uploaded to YouTube where everyone can see it? Is it somewhere, where Freedom of Information Act requests, where everyone can see every minute of every on-duty police officer's life? That if you're on duty with a gun, anyone can access that? Or, as often happens, is the footage only released after being censored, after being edited, that it's controlled, and that sometimes conveniently police departments just say they lost the footage isn't available. So if you follow these kinds of things in politics, you are aware these are issues. The existence and presence of the so-called body cam, that's the term, the body cam. Oh, so only police officers are going to wear a body cam, huh? Not soldiers in time of war? Does that matter more or less? Again, taxi drivers? Okay, what about the mayor? The mayor has no body cam? It's all just he said, she said shit for the mayor? What about your member of parliament? Like, what about really important political events? Secrecy, anonymity, impunity, or accountability, transparency? Now, again, I used the example of a university professor for a reason. Now, I realize it may seem like a stretch. We're talking about gun violence. Now you're talking about a university professor preaching from the pulpit to his students, okay? I have known so many university professors who would be ashamed to watch the film of their own behavior back again. They'd be so ashamed just to hear the words out of their own mouth. I've known university professors who showed up drunk to give their lectures. There are university professors who show up under the influence of other drugs, but there are also just university professors who have a short fuse, who lose their temper. There are professors who preach ridiculous, extreme political ideologies, extreme political views, right? And without even someone else to criticize them. I'm just talking about people I've known, right? I could sit down with some of these people and just play the tape. Like, did you realize you said that? Like, did you? This will bring about a change on the part of the behavior of the university professor. Now, guys, students are not angels. You know, I wonder what impact it would have if you started really invigilating the behavior of students. Where it's like, look, not only is it we know you cheated on the test, it's a real issue, and I've really seen it, cheating on tests and exams. But like where some authority figure is sitting down with the student saying, look, this is what you did during that 1 hour lecture. You played video games. Sitting like, we know, we have videotape evidence that you sat and played video games. You weren't paying attention. You're not taking notes. You're not doing this. You're not that. But, you know, maybe that you were sleeping, whatever. I mean, I've been in the room where every other student behind, aside from myself, the extent to which they're in no way participating in their own education, or they're not doing what academia demands of them. And you can have rules, you can enforce this, you can enforce higher standards of excellence in behavior. So yes, Sam Walsh mentions car dash cams. So this is a camera on the dashboard of a car. Cars now increasingly have cameras built in them. Yeah, I mean, I'm just barely old enough to remember when that was new, you know. But for my generation, I mean, if you were just 5 years younger than me, you didn't see that change. I remember reading a story in the newspaper, and it was very moving. And it was from a black guy describing the racism of the police. This was in Toronto, in Canada, and them grabbing him and throwing him on the hood of the car and this stuff, you know. But what happened at that time was that you found that many of the people who at that time, because they weren't aware of the dashboard cameras themselves, like, because it was that new, many of the people who claimed the police were racist and claimed they were corrupt and claimed misconduct, the dash cam footage proved that the person making that complaint was either deeply dishonest or insane or both. I saw a lot of that just at that time, right? When it was really new, that actually people had become accustomed to being able to make up stories about police misconduct. Now, some of the police misconduct was real, but so many people were lying before the advent of the dash cam, right? So this is another real change, right? So yeah, this is an answer waiting for someone to ask the question. As soon as we allow the regulation of guns, this is the answer, not just in the United States, in Switzerland, in Taiwan, in Japan, in communist China. The answer already exists. The answer is there, and the answer is irrefutable. Some things are so trivial They should not be recorded by hidden cameras. Well, I'm not going to say hidden cameras, miniature cameras, portable cameras, right? If you put your kid into a daycare center, do you want the daycare center to have cameras on all the time? Let's say one kid in a million dies in a horrible accident while they're at a daycare center, right? Let's say something terrible happens to just one kid in a million at a daycare center. Do you want it recorded if something goes wrong? If your kid is somehow hurt or harmed, do you want to have recording of that? We accept that pilots in airplanes have no privacy. There is a black box recorder in every cockpit. Every single word that the pilot says is recorded. Every decision, every button he or she presses while flying the plane. Why? Because it matters. We have an uniterated, unspoken standard that some things matter, so they must be recorded, however inconvenient or embarrassing. Again, there's a further question that requires legislation, requires an amendment to the Constitution, I think in every country in the world is. What happens to that footage? Does everyone get to hear it? Like, is there an access? Is there a process where when the plane crashes, if my ex-wife dies in the plane crash or something, I want to know exactly what went wrong with the pilot? Can I access the recordings? Can anyone, or is it only released when some government agency or some private corporation has had the opportunity to censor it, to decide whether or not it'll be employed? These are big, momentous questions, right? Something as seemingly trivial as dropping your kid off at daycare, something that obviously involves life and death decisions like flying an airplane. When you pull the trigger of a gun, how can that possibly be less significant a decision than pressing send on a text message? Of course, your location should be recorded. Of course, a digital photograph should be taken. Of course, it should be uploaded to a database. Your pinpoint location on a map and these other details should be immortalized. They should be available to the authorities, to the police. I would say they should be available to journalists or to anyone who's interested. Your own relatives, your own cousin is wondering what happened in that shooting and you were involved with. They should be able to get the objective truth, right? And we have already decided that we're willing to sacrifice our so-called privacy, a concept that's not in the Constitution, that's not legally defined, it's just a cultural notion of privacy. We have decided that we're willing to give up that privacy every time we send an email from a cellular phone, every time we send a text message. Of course, we should give up the idea of impunity, anonymity, privacy when we pull the trigger of a gun. Of course. There are not two sides to that debate. There is one answer, and it's the same answer for Switzerland, for Taiwan, for Thailand, as it is for the United States of America. It is an answer waiting for someone being willing to ask the question.